Take a letter, Maria. Address it to my wife. Tell her that I'm coming home on a Saturday night. I'll wait for my friend. Let's see here. One moment. Hey, got the music going. I'm waiting for Merritt. He's supposed to come talk to me. I want to ask him some stuff. I like Merritt. I like Crimson Air. But, yeah. The whole thing with, like, are you sick? How you doing, Janet? I've been so busy. Let's see. I saw some emails for you. I just did Rob's earlier. Yeah, I think Rob, talking about Rob Reed, I thought that was pretty cool what he said. Some of the stuff he said, as far as what I kind of had the impression, I thought it was cool what he was saying. I think I should probably take down what I posted earlier this morning. Just, but I think that people need to remember history. The Protestant Reformation was very important, and it's scary that people forget how that happened, And that's why I think the view of time is important to understand how historical, and that I have very serious issues with what the Protestant reformers believed in most cases, certain doctrines and how they acted. But I think we should recognize that God is like drawing people towards the truth, away from the error that was suppressing all the saints in history through the Dark Ages and stuff. There's a really big push to say that the Dark Ages weren't really the Dark Ages. On a spiritual level, they were the Dark Ages. Almost nobody had access to the truth. But let's see. I think I almost want to change my channel and just focus on that more historical context of the Reformation and not focus on any particular, necessarily any specific view, and a lot of different views. Kind of have like actually have as many views as possible that agree with that idea about remembering our past, because this famous quote that if we forget our past, we're doomed to repeat it. And, it just seems like it's all built towards that. I know a lot of people don't think some people think there's a second coming. If you believe, let's put it this way, if you believe there's a second coming of Jesus to the earth to finish up the age, a lot of stuff is connected to that. And if that's true, which it is, as far as I'm concerned, there is no faith without that concept. But I wouldn't call somebody not a Christian if they don't agree with that. But I think, for me anyway, the way I understand the faith and the scripture, I think we must believe that there's a second coming, and so much is tied to that. That's why I always push the whole thing about the whole death thing and heaven and when you die and stuff. I think is important, because if everybody understood what I think is true about that, I think there would be no room for things like preterism, which has to, because there's really nothing in the Bible about like you die and you go to heaven, and that's kind of just like eternity, is you go to heaven and you live there. So we don't need a consummation of the ages. It's kind of where you have to go if you're a full preterist, it seems to me anyway. I guess some full preterists think there's a second coming of Jesus yet to happen. But if that's true, so much is connected to that in the New Testament. You can't just say just that's yet to be fulfilled. Or I mean, you can. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So, but if you understand that that's a necessary thing to happen, the resurrection from the dead, at the end of the age, which clearly hasn't occurred yet because my grandma's still dead, then so much flows out of that and corrects so much error in the believing in the church, and it eliminates so many things that are false, in my opinion. So, so I don't know. Let's see if I can find a crimson ice with the join me here. He will any second now, but hold on. And then I'm going to read John 14 because people never read that. Or maybe it's, John 14. I got to find. I know where he is, so I'm going to find him. Hey, Ryan. You can join too if you want. I was so impressed with the way you interacted on my channel that I gave you a wrench. If you didn't notice. When I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. So much private interpretation going on in Christian channels. I know. If everybody would just agree with me, it would all work out. Asia is bad on Merritt. Oh yeah. I was just listening to that Ace. Yeah, dude, I go over there all the time. Like I have these mood swings with it too, and I'll flip out on them sometimes. But yeah, so much rhetoric. That's all they got, though, right? I don't even know why they bothered trying to use the scripture. It's kind of a perverse thing, right? It's hard to love people, and so I just make sure I call them out every time and heavily for the sake of other people. Yeah, it's hard to keep balance with this sort of thing, because you can get. I start to get drawn up in almost like you could say taking it too serious, and then I start getting all condemning in a bad way, probably, although I really don't like the idea of schmoozing people either. Like, oh, I'm going to treat you nice because then I can kind of get you to slide over to agree with me, and that feels gross to me. Although I get accused of that, and then you get accused of if you're just really frank about something, then you get accused of being rude or mean. It's like, it's so hard to hear people out, though. Like, you should have seen it on just earlier. Like Dave news unit's trying to promote the guys at dispensationalist, and I've really been practicing patience with those people, but I think they're just scarily misinformed. Like if you give too much to false views, you give the impression that to get them to think that they're convincing you too. You don't want to give them a false impression. It's weird. I overanalyze everything, but okay, I'm gonna go see if I can hunt down Merritt. He's probably still at Praises. He said he was gonna come over, so I don't know. Oh, I'm in the wrong account. But yeah, that Zechariah thing. Me and Ryan were talking about that earlier, and there's some difficult. And Zechariah is one of the more difficult books, as well as Daniel 8 and 11 are very classically difficult. Yeah, I mean, he thinks Satan's going to be saved. It's like, dude, no matter what your view on hell is, that's clearly not the case. So, yeah, and there's got to be a better way. I want to try to, and I've been saying this since I started, really, and I haven't really gone. It's like you try to build an audience and get people to regularly join you, and then you're happy if you can get that. And so you never really get organized unless, without it'd be nice to have a little more steady of people that would join the panel that were respectable, and then I'm trying to contact people. I'm just so busy. But I have some people I've been kind of trying to get to know that are like, actual pastors and, really, people that are studied or even schooled in theology that are may or may not be pastors that I can interview. I need to put more time into that and making it more organized. I need to make notes before I do an actual thing. I used to be better at just kind of off the cuff, but I just really have a hard time putting my thoughts together. I wanted to say so much more about this preacher guy, right? I have all these thoughts and ideas, and I just can't even put the thoughts together once I come online. I don't know why I struggle. So I think I need to practice more. It'd be a lot more effective and stuff floating around up stuff in here. Okay, let's see if I can find it. I can find it. Let's see. Try to pick it. Okay. So my opinion is that Dave in his unit is probably a drug addict, and maybe not, and that he because he has these weird mood swings. I mean, it could be just lack of sleep, I guess, but those kind of things stick up. I was a really bad drug addict for a long time, so I don't mean a casual drug user. I mean daily, severe, and it was a long battle. And so that stuff is not hard for me to see. I don't know. I hope he's all right. I think he means well on a certain level, but he just goes off the handle, man. Weird, crazy stuff like kick the dog, beat your wife, sort of stuff, So you wonder, you can get pretty crazy when I can get done. We all have not. Yeah, those edges. Let's see what he said here. Hopefully they'll count. You must have a notification. Let me pull up. No one ever brings this up, and I think it's like really good teaching or uses. But no one ever talks about John 14. I'm just waiting for Crimson Hair because I wanted to talk to him about some stuff he's been bringing up. So, okay, this is not what I had in mind, maybe. I always get these mixed up. I think it's John 16. John 14 is the passage about second coming that people got to get in tune with. But this is what I was thinking of. Maybe I'm thinking of the latter half of John 14 and forget. Here's an interesting question. Should we apply John 16, 1 and 2 to a future condition of the church before Jesus returns? These things have I spoken unto you, that you should not be offended. I want to be that guy so bad. It's so hard. I want to be so secure that I can't get offended when people spout off. They shall put you out of the synagogues. Well, that must be talking about the first century. Well, sure, but does it have application to the end? Because there's a clear out overlap between and Daniel, you see it, and Jesus speaking in Matthew 24, you see this, that he's speaking about that to them. Here's the thing, and here's the problem with people who are not, they want to deny partial preterism, right? Which means you believe some things are for the first century, but you're not a full preterist. You just recognize that Jesus is speaking to us. That's what is the sign of your coming in the end of the age or the end of the world, which is kind of mirrored in Daniel. The time of the end and the end of the world. Depending on your translation, there's kind of like two things being mentioned there. So it seems to be stretching to Jesus' time from Daniel and also the very end of time. Because that's clear in Daniel 12. And we know it's also clear that it's speaking of Jesus' day. So there's kind of an already but not yet. And whatever Jesus tells them about what they may suffer in the Christian era of the first century, especially during the temple being destroyed, is in passages that are parallel to things that must be talking about the end of time. So my question is this something we should think about? Because the Antichrist will, in some way or another, be worshipped in the place of Christ. Okay? And if we apply this to those who take the mark of the beast, or if it's those who are in the time of trouble or the tribulation, or just a warning to us too before Jesus comes, if we happen to be alive right before he returns. The time cometh that whosoever killeth you will think that he does God a favor. If this has parallel application, and I think it does, something no one ever talks about, I think the filthy atheists are going to be the ones persecuting them. I think it's going to be false believers in God against, so a lot of people say it's Muslims. That could be. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying, there he is. There he is. Hey, man, what's up?
Hey, Jamie. I'm on my phone right now, and I'll try to stay as long as my phone is
no problem,
is able to handle it.
I just saw your question and he never got to it. I was just curious what you were thinking about that. Just curious. The whole Matthew 24.
Oh, right. So for me personally, by the way, is my sound coming through clear, or is it sounding muffled up?
Very clear.
Oh, awesome. I'm using AirPods. I'm sorry, your AirPods. It's got the mic on it. Hold on, let me just take that out so that it doesn't eat up the battery.
That's the verse about the fleeing on the Sabbath day. Is that the one thing, or is it something else?
Right. Matthew 24, verse 20. I was skeptical about a Christian needing to observe the Sabbath day. I've heard people interpret the Sabbath as something that is kept in a spiritual kind of way that is not kept formally. I've heard Ken Hovind say that it's a sign just between God and Israel. I've heard other interpretations like Praise and Olive had mentioned that Jesus is the Sabbath rest for the Christians in the New Covenant. And on the other side, though, I've heard you mention verses from Isaiah, which very clearly declares that the Sabbath is going to be observed to some degree, in some way, shape, or fashion, shape or form, in the millennial, in the time frame which can only fit in the millennial kingdom, from what I can tell, right? And probably throughout all eternity after that. Right.
Yeah. Right. I would take it as not necessarily having to be during the millennium. But yeah, after the return of Christ into the future, if not indefinitely, right? That may not be that.
Right.
The eschaton and beyond.
And that's where I haven't heard any coherent rebuttal to that challenge from the passage in the book of Isaiah. Now, the thing that kind of pushed me over the deciding line as to whether or not the Sabbath is to be formally observed by Christians is, of course, Matthew 24:20, which was the last verse pertaining to the Sabbath that I stumbled across, and it was by accident because I accidentally stumbled on it when SFT was talking to you about eschatology, and oh no, I'm sorry, it may have been when he was talking with Justin about the pre-trib rapture. But anyway, somebody was going over Matthew 24, and as I was looking through it, I stumbled across that verse. And logically, the only way that I can see a Christian not wanting to have to go any place on the Sabbath is if the Sabbath is still legally in effect. So I'm sure that they can find ways to get out of it, but
What's
just
funny though is that people like SFT who want to like deny preterism. Oh shucks. Hopefully you can still hear me. But so the issue is that if you take the view that he does and pretend like partial preterism isn't true, like there was no context for so this is where it's like you can tell people haven't really studied it. I don't know. Were you hearing me at all?
I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. My phone just went to the home page, and
Yeah, I hate that.
the Chrome thing just shut off. I had to. I don't know if it was something. I don't think I pressed anything.
It's funny because most people I'll try to steel man the other side. I'll say it like the best argument I think they could have is like, and that's kind of my goal usually, is to try to like see how people are going to read things and be fair that way. Cause I think I'm going to be like pretty stern on certain things. Obviously I do think this is a good indication that the Sabbath is binding. And so I'm going to say like, but if I give them the best argument they can come up with, usually it would be is to take a partial preterist view, which I'm sorry, to deny partial preterism, especially in Matthew 24, it's like if I was going to go into Daniel and try to say like, it can't be Titus because whatever, it's not in the 70 weeks, or something, or like say it's, whatever, something like, look, Jesus was talking to the disciples and he was telling them something that meant something to them at the time they lived. And we know that before the temple was destroyed, according to Luke 23, is fulfilled. Think about Jesus talking to his disciples and telling them all these things and then acting like it's all future, like future to us today only, is to be like totally like doesn't make any sense, right? The context, this is one of those examples where the context wouldn't make any sense that was a real event. Like, hey guys, when you see it surrounding Jerusalem, flee to the hills of it's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it just makes sense. We know that they fled to Petra. The Christians did before Rome destroyed the temple, and they didn't die. And so Jesus' prediction is fulfilled, and it's also future. There's indications of that as well, but let's not deny that it's both, because we know historically that it happened, just like we know historically Titus destroyed Jerusalem. And so, and it's funny about the Titus thing. I wanted to tell you this too. It's like, it's fact that Titus actually told his army not to destroy the temple historically, but they didn't listen and they caught on fire, and then they ended up breaking it down against the Titus's command. So he actually didn't command them to destroy it. So it is the people in view, not Titus. If it was anything regarding who destroyed the city, it's the people of the prince, because Titus himself didn't actually say to do that. But that's not a big point. But so I would say that's what they ought to do, is to recognize partial preterism, because you don't have to deny the future thing. I certainly don't. I just don't deny historical facts about that. But then they could say, well, it has application to the first century because it's still kind of like a shifting time of the Jewish era, right? The temple's still standing, or it's about to be destroyed, right? So like they're saying like, pray doesn't come on a Sabbath day because you'll catch flack from the Jews, right? So they could make that argument, but I think that's still constrained, right? Because it doesn't say that. And of course, because of what we see in Isaiah. Now, it's what's funny too, is I'm not a futurist or a fundamentalist in the way that futurists are, like evangelicals strictly are, even though I'm like an evangelical, I guess. A lot of people say Adventists are essentially, just with few diversions of doctrine or differences of doctrine. But I like the idea of keeping the text as literal as we can, right, according to the context or whatever. But right. I think the problem everybody makes is, so I'm more inclined to say, look, we got to look if this is speaking to a time that is well after the cross, at the end of the age, the end of the world, and it's talking about it before the New Testament or before Christ's covenant has been made, and taken away the animal sacrificial system and the temple service on earth. But it's written down way before that, when they still have a temple on earth. Then we ought to take that language and understand that those things pointed to Christ's ministry, and then interpret it, if it's something happening after his ministry, as it talking about the thing that it represents. Get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So like if the tabernacles is supposed to represent Christ's ministry and how he tabernacled with us, and God is like with man or something, then when it talks about keeping the Feast of Tabernacles before Christ fulfills that thing, and nobody knows about how he's fulfilled it yet when it was written, and we know it's future to us even now, I think it makes sense that we read that to be talking about what that part of the first covenant represented with Christ, and we should read it though it's talking about that thing, which it relates to Christ's ministry rather than the thing itself. Now that's the whole big question about, well, do you think the old covenant's going to come back before Jesus returns because of Daniel? Or seeing this is where this is like kind of the whole basis of the difference with, like, and why I say like SFT has no reason to like posit the idea that like the old temple, I mean, most people will say, well, yeah, but it's not going to be true of God, like it's not going to be God's holy temple. But it's like, but that's the way it talks about it. It's saying this thing that Antichrist does is negative to the temple service. He's going to desecrate God's temple. Well, the problem with that is, if you think about it, unless you make up some really weird, diverse, really divergent ideas, which people do now with hyper dispensationalism, and say the gospel wasn't even for the Jews, the gospel that Jesus brought, this is for the Gentiles. They didn't do what they're supposed to. Now God's going to bring back their thing later. But who wants to actually say that? Like, Christ brought the salvation in Christ was promised to the Jews, and then we're brought into that. It goes to the Gentiles. But like, you don't want to say like they have to have like God's going to bring the temple back and they're going to do their sacrifices, or is Jesus their sacrifice? That's what I would say. And so it's problematic to try to say, well, it's going to be a temple, but it's not going to be applicable. But you're arguing that these texts in Daniel say that he's going to desecrate the temple, the Antichrist. But how do you desecrate something that would be an abomination to God in and of itself, understanding that Jesus is fulfilled? I mean, I read it earlier in a stream today, for like 10 minutes, where I'm like, look, guys, Daniel, like, it's very clear in the book of Hebrews that Jesus has fulfilled all those things in the temple services from the new covenant is for everybody. So how could it be a desecration in a literal temple? And we see in the New Testament all this temple talk, right? And so I'm sorry, I just want to get all that out to try to help you see where I'm coming from. But as far as the Sabbath, so in a way you could appeal to my own view about what people call spiritualizing, right? I don't really think it's that. I'd say it's fullnessizing it, because that was always God's thing. We should focus on Jesus' covenant, and that was God's focus for history for everybody. And now that it's come, we should read it that way. What do you think about those ideas? Do you have any thoughts on
that? That's certainly a new way to look at it that I haven't been introduced to previously, and I'll have to think about it. It sounds coherent from what I can tell so far. What you've spoken now, what that has the thought that has provoked is the timing in it. In Matthew 24, Jesus begins by saying that the temple will be torn down, and then he goes on to say that things will get bad, but these are the beginning of sorrows. The gospel will be preached throughout all the world, and then the end will come. And then when you get to verse 20, and then it brings up the Sabbath. And you were mentioning about the temple, and how Jesus, by instituting the new covenant, done away with the sacrificial system once and for all. And so, are you tying the Sabbath with the cessation of the animal sacrifice in any way?
I don't think that's appropriate, and I mean, we can go into that if you want, because so the main
Yeah,
arguments
because
against that.
in
Yeah,
verse 20, if somebody were to say, well, if the temple is still standing at the time that you would be advised to flee into the mountains, then could that still be
yeah, right,
could the
right.
Sabbath be done away with after that? You see, like could they?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, like it's possible. Like I'm just thinking, like what they could say. I don't obviously I don't think that's how it worked, right?
Yeah, yeah, because then you still have Isaiah that can't be so
Right, because in it, so I like to point out, and I don't feel like people grasp what I'm really actually saying and the weight of this argument. But the thing is, like, and many scholars of many different groups have pointed this out. Not, I can get you, tons of quote. This is just facts, but like, it's clear that the Ten Commandments, as far as principles and like things God intended for man, are all can be found in Genesis. Like, maybe not explicitly, but like, and then he, of course, with the Sabbath thing that's interesting is he establishes it. So he makes the first seventh day, he rests, and it says he sanctified it, making it holy, the very first one, because, and
that's right.
it's very detailed, because he rested. And then, so it's like he made the seventh day holy, right? So it's like, and then we've had a 7-day week cycle, one after the other, presumably, right? I mean, obviously, from the very beginning, from the first seventh day. And it's the Sabbath of the Lord because he rested on it and sanctified it. So it says it was made holy from the beginning. And so it's like, even if there's no command, so that's the idea. And he did that, like, now there's no command until Exodus 16 or something, but like the idea would be like, was it not holy from there forward? I mean, because that's what it says. And
That's
so
right.
he intended that from the beginning, before man even sinned, right? And so the things with the animal sacrifices, what are those for? Well, it says Paul says they were added for sins, which means that part of the law was added. There was a part of the law that was added because of the sins of the covenant people, right? And so they were added for a way for God to take away their sins, right? So he didn't have to execute them according to the covenant he makes on Sinai. And then these things happen as, out of Egypt is the first one. They haven't made the covenant yet. So Passover is actually before the covenant. But I think the festivals are like, we're typing Christ. So it was kind of like, it shows God's providence, right? Because Paul says they were an example. And so those things are like events that happened in their real history, which, by the way, is an amazing proof of the Bible, because when the Jews got separated and were dispersed into the nations, they all kept these festivals that were based on events that happened between them and God. And if like, how do you get a whole nation to agree to a made up story about a thing and then have a festival and a reoccurring holiday according to that festival, and then they all get dispersed but continue in their dispersion and separation to keep the festivals? That's not based on something where one guy said, hey guys, we're going to make up this story and this is why we're going to keep this holiday, so just all of you play along. If it was something like that and they get dispersed like shortly thereafter, they wouldn't keep those holidays still if they were just made up. The fact that they all kept the holidays through history when they were dispersed proves that they're based on real events. And I think there's arguments that people have written papers on that. I highly encourage people to look at
Yeah,
that.
and what you just said, what you said earlier about the how God had sanctified the seventh day from the very beginning, it it made me realize that because he made it a special day, the people, I mean, the people even before the flood would have, I suspect, the God-fearing people would have known about it, and I suspect they would have even observed it. Now, following that, I have to wonder if Job had even kept the Sabbath, because it in the book of Job, he's described. God even calls him upright and perfect. Now, I understand there are different degrees of perfection. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to mean that he was sinlessly perfect. But if God is praising him to such a degree, then I think it's reasonable to at least take into consideration the possibility that Job not only was aware of a basic concept of God's moral laws, but that in addition to that, he observed the Sabbath, because you can't, if God was, I'm sorry, if Job was upright and uh, and
God
uh,
fearing.
yeah, if he was of such a high moral stature, then he would have had to have known the laws that Moses related to the people of his own congregation. And if Job if Job knew the laws, then he would have had to have known the Sabbath. And I think it's because you know how in the Old Covenant it was it, it was given as a
A
the
sign for
it,
the
it was
covenant.
it was a general expectation, I guess you could say, that what you give is what you get, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And it always struck my fascination how in the book of Job he uh, related he was how he did not pray for, how he did not desire in his heart for harm to come to his enemies, but rather prayed for his enemies. Um, when I first read the book of Job in from start to finish, I was mystified by that, because that wasn't something that you would get from the congregation of Israel in the Old Covenant. That's what you got from Jesus, and yet here you have Job existing possibly even before Moses, saying that he prays for his enemies, and he's exhibiting the love of Christ there.
Right. We
Uh,
kind of, I think, are you saying kind of like, I think the common idea that Christians have often, and I mean that generally speaking, okay,
yeah,
the
and
law
that's
didn't
why,
actually have that intention, right? And so I think that's wrong. I think the Jews had messed it up in Jesus' day, and he was trying to correct it. It wasn't that the law was actually always bad or something, or it
right.
wasn't supposed to produce good fruit. But yes, they were. Yeah, sorry, keep continue. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so when God uh, declared Job to be upright and perfect, saying to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Um, I, I wonder if Job really had reached a level of sinless perfection that maybe he wasn't sinlessly perfect during the time that he went through his trial when he was under attack by Satan, but certainly after that, I suspect, because his faith would have been pretty strong even then. I mean, living
Right.
in
He was
such,
right before God in some sense, right? Maybe not perfect, but perfect in the sense that
yeah,
what
in
God
that
wants to
his,
bring us to.
exactly right, in that his justification was by faith, where the Israelites, generally speaking, failed because they didn't pursue after justification before God by faith. Many of them, well, you know this, many of them clung to the animal sacrifice atonement, to the point where God had uh, no desire in it, and they just
Right.
made it a repetitious thing, where it became kind of like the Catholic indulgence thing. You sin, you pay a little fine, and there you go, you're fine. Again, you can sin again, and then just pay another, uh, you know, uh,
Exactly.
penalty fee.
That's got to be what's going on, because so many
Yeah,
people
and
go all sorts of crazy places with the when it says God doesn't want their sacrifices. They'll
yeah.
make crazy stuff about it,
So
like God never wanted it or something.
yeah, so concerning the Sabbath in Matthew 24, if someone were to try to qualify that in a way that tied it to the destruction of the temple, I would find that to be less than convincing, only because they would have to eisegete that. They wouldn't have any specific passage in canon scripture that I think they could use that to their advantage. And so, aside from that, the only other vulnerability that I can see in which they can undermine that, the interpretation that the Sabbath is still in effect throughout the covenant, is if would be the same way how a Seventh Day Adventist would probably try to reinterpret, or I shouldn't say reinterpret, just going by their interpretation, how they go about Colossians, where it says, "Let no man judge you, new moon, Sabbath, and so on." So if they, how you apply that as not pertaining to the Sabbath, do you see any leeway for them doing the same thing with Matthew 24:20?
So that's kind of what I was saying. They could kind of go that way, but I don't think it works because especially if they want to take it literally. So it's kind of like this kind of catch-22 where like I'm more willing to like take these Old Testament prophecies that are for the future and spiritualize them. They don't want to do that. So it's like, so they can tell me like, well, you're inconsistent. What, and I did a video on this responding to Dr. Michael Brown, because he was trying to say, well, that one verse says you should one new moon to another and one Sabbath to another. Well, let's talk about the festivals too, or the one about tabernacles, right? Well, I would say that, see, like that's kind of where the weight of my argument is earlier is kind of trying to make a differentiation. Like the Sabbath is a moral law. It's put in the Decalogue, right? So that we're amongst moral, like unchanging moral principles. If you just think about it for a second, like you could ask the question, why is the Sabbath added into these moral laws? It's right in the middle of these moral laws, right? So that is the fact of the matter. Now you could ask, well, is this really a moral law? And I would say yes, and get back to that. But because it was established before sin, but the festivals and things are not moral laws. They're how God communicated what Christ's ministry would be, and how God made provision
exactly.
for sin. And so but the Sabbath wasn't a provision for sin. It's a memorial of God's creative power. And just the fact that, look, he made it that day. So he sanctified that day, which is a particular day in the cycle of days in a week, which is a sign of God creating, because it's not astronomical. So it's really a proof. If everybody had kept the Sabbath, kept keeping the Sabbath, they probably, evolution probably never would have gotten even started, right? Christians wouldn't have been duped if they had been, because they never would have forgot God that where that week came from. I mean, you still could, obviously, but it'd be less likely, right? And so it's a memorial of the creation. And the fact of the matter is, look, God declared it holy that day in the cycle. And look, there's nothing in the Bible that says it's not holy anymore. Like you can get all tripped up in like, well, I mean, like, look at the early church. I mean, the church changed it really. There were people keeping Sunday or not Saturday early on, and they say it's for the resurrection. And but the fact of the matter is, in Scripture, there's nothing that says the day changed. So how can you possibly say the Sabbath which was a memorial of creation? There's nothing about that. So here's the other thing. People say, well, Christ is our rest. And I say, amen. But look, the Sabbath is a moral command. Why? Because everybody needs a day off. So that's part of it. You need rest. And God instituted that day, right? And so it's like, if you look how important it was to the Jews, it's like, there's no way out of that. And so you need to afford people a day off. Christ being your rest does not make it that you don't need to sleep anymore or take days off. You still need rest.
That's right. That is entirely logical, because to that extent, it could be said that the Sabbath day, when it was sanctified and blessed by God, right after Adam was created, was made for man already, because God doesn't need rest, but he was already setting a example for how man ought to operate, and when and how long he should rest in a repetitious cycle, throughout existence. And so you could say that the Sabbath was created always for man.
Not man for the Sabbath. So it was meant as a blessing for us. But I think there's three main aspects to always remember. It is a moral law because you need to afford, because it says like the stranger within your gate gets to keep the Sabbath. Also, even the animals, the beast of burden, so to speak, they need to get rest too. You can't work them 24/7 or every day. They need a day
That's right.
off. And so that being if you just consider the fact how God made it holy, what he declared about it, and how it's afforded, even in the old covenant, it was afforded to foreigners or people that work for you. And so the principle is like, you can't, and when it talks about in Egypt, right? One of the main things, now it's a different form of the word Sabbath. as far as it says, Pharaoh doesn't them Sabbath, or it's not the Sabbath, but it's the same form of the word, right? He wasn't giving them rest. He was working them every day. And that was part of the specific oppression. Whether you want to take that as like, you're not giving them a Sabbath, which was clearly just talking about God's Sabbath, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that just goes to show that you need the rest. But God also says you need to honor how long will you profane my Sabbath? So it's also a memorial that he's creator and that you're recognizing what he made holy. So it's not just a moral aspect, but it is a moral aspect regarding, the necessity of man to rest. I'm sorry. And so, yes, Christ is our rest, salvation, but as far as like our practical, do not lie and cheat, don't hurt each other. Sabbath is moral in that sense. And then also it's a convocation in some sense, right? Gathering. I like to look at it like it's a thing where it's the commandment, the last commandment that is said to like how to love God in the first tablet of the commandments. And then the next one is about, 6 through 10 is about loving man. And I always thought it was kind of cool how the Sabbath was something you do to honor God as creator, but also to afford to man, if you have employees or for your family or yourself, to afford them rest and yourself. And it was a time to gather as a body of believers, where the believers gathered together and could have service or a convocation or whatever, right? To like either now we talk, for church or whatever, or for just, it was called a convocation in that sense, where they gathered to honor that day and to rest mainly was the commandment. But I think that's interesting how it kind of it's kind of like glue. It's like you honor God individually and then collectively you do that together. And so in a way it like connects a kind of a melding of the commandments towards God and the commandments towards man, how to love your man and how to love God. And it's kind of both. The Sabbath is kind of a thing for both, a corporate way to do that together, to honor God and each other. And Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath, right? And so I just think that's kind of cool because he's like the glue between man and God as well. Like he's the Jacob's ladder, the mediator between God and man. And he calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. He says it was for man, not man for it. People take that as if he's crapping on it. And I'm thinking, no, I think that's a totally wrong reading, right? It's like reading a bias into it. He's saying you guys have corrupted my Sabbath. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I make the rules. I think Jesus was the one that came on Sinai. So he's rebuking them for falsely condemning him and his disciples, and saying like, look, the Sabbath isn't a burden. It's supposed to be a day where you rest, and that like it's okay to do good on the Sabbath and stuff like that. So that's kind of a nuanced issue, but I just think it's and people say it's a burden or something, and I just laugh because I'm just like, what, am I supposed to work on the day? But anyway, but as far as Colossians, I just wanted to say real quick. Sorry, I keep blabbing on and on.
Oh, it's fine.
If you compare it to the only place it's in a similar form, it's kind of like a weird triplet form, it's called or something. You can look at Hosea 2:11, and that's the same form, and the only other time it's in that exact form. And I've been looking at different interpretations. And I think actually the best one is the one I just recently heard. I have a couple of videos on this where this scholar who has like 4 PhDs did his whole dissertation on it. And it's the most complete dissertation anybody's ever done on the text. That one verse, it's like 1,000 pages long, and it's a 2-part interview. If you're curious about it, just watch the second one. You'll have to find it on my thing, but it's Colossians 2, whatever, 16 or whatever. But they go on. The first video is like not as productive as far as telling you the facts about his dissertation, but right from the start on the part 2. But the one I think is the most plausible is it says, most translations say, let no man judge you in food or drink, or in regards to a holy day, new moons, Sabbath or Sabbath days. Now, another way it can be rendered in the Greek and is more plausible now that I see this interpretation, he's saying, let no man judge you regarding food and drink. All right, let me see. No man judge you in food and drinks, like is in the offerings, right? In regards to, which is a totally proper way to translate it into the English. So let no man judge you in the food and drink offerings in regards to the festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths. And so, which is the body of Christ, right? So what is the body of Christ? Well, he's his body, or they translate it substance in the King James, right? So the substance, so the the sacrifice or the offering of food and drink on those holy days of the recurring new moons, which were called Sabbaths, by the way, plural. His body is the sacrifice. So don't let anybody judge you about you not giving offerings on the festivals, because they typed Christ's ministry, and he is the substance now because he is the once for all offering. And so that to me makes the most sense, because what he says about it, the body is of Christ. Now, and then when you look at Hosea, I think I actually have it here in a slide, but Hosea 2:11, it uses the same form where it does it in the triplet form, where it says God doesn't want their new moons, festivals, and Sabbaths. And then if you have any confusion, it goes on to say, it makes it specific in the context that it's constrained to just talking about those festival Sabbaths. And so that's the only other verse that has the exact same form of the.
That's right. I agree. Colossians gives
I lost you there. I can't hear you. Yeah, it goes on to say he nailed to the cross the handwriting of ordinances. And if you go back to the Old Testament and you look up that same phrase, it says the handwritten part of the law of Moses that was against us, contrary to us, was put in beside the ark. Sorry, you're back.
So Colossians Colossians contains the context by which we can interpret Sabbaths under in the context of how a festive event is observed, or when it's observed, whereas Matthew 24 does not. That Matthew 24 is just the default reference to the Sabbath, singular. So here, like you, exactly what you said. So I agree with that. And so overall, I see the Sabbath, the day of rest, being still in effect, and probably the dietary laws as well, although there's probably a little more flexibility there.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it's less. It seems less. Like there seems to be reason to think it's not necessarily binding, although that it is.
Yeah.
I just take on a principled matter. Like it seems like it gives you could say I know my pastor used to tell me if he goes to a guy's house and they serve him unclean or whatever, he'll eat it to be polite, but he won't.
Right.
Sort of thing. We look at it it's healthy. Well, God did it for a reason, not just for symbolic purposes. So
yeah, and even without Matthew 24, the bottom line for me ultimately is that Jesus said, "Not a jot or a tittle shall pass from the law," and the Sabbath was part of the Ten Commandments. And I'm not. There are probably different sects within SDA. And I'm certainly, even if I were to encourage Christians to observe the Sabbath, I would never try to push the idea that you need to do so to keep your salvation. It's that if you are a regenerated Christian, you will want to keep it, and I actually do. When I've heard, because back in the days, I would always. I was only watching Ken Hoven's YouTube channel ever since he started to repost content on it. After he got out of prison, and several times people asked him the question about the Sabbath, and he simply responded.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, saying that it's a sign between God and Israel. I'm not an Israeli person. I'm Norwegian, so it has nothing to do with me. Yeah. That never quite went. That never sat well with me, because for a person who is grafted in, you are. And by the way, I felt vindicated by that when I read these verses in the Old Testament about the Persians converting themselves into Judaism, and they were called Jews. So it was more of a spiritual context
Yeah,
rather than
even back then, right? People miss that. It's very important. They want
right.
to pretend like it's not a thing.
So
It's like it's a mixed multitude.
that's right, and the same thing again in Isaiah. All nations will come into the house of the Lord and will glorify. God said that all nations will go to His holy mountain and glorify Him there. They will bring
Yeah,
offerings and vessels and so on, and so everybody's going to. Uh, it's all inclusive. It's not, so
hmm
that never sat well with me. And so Jesus said the law, no part of the law will pass. The Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments. And I've always had a soft spot for it. Um, I've never um, I've never wanted to blatantly just ignore it or abandon it. And I think I would agree that it shouldn't be looked at as a burden to keep because everybody rests during the week. Just arrange it so that you rest on um, Saturday, I guess. Uh,
yeah. You don't
now,
have to be a Seventh-day Adventist. I mean, there's other
now,
groups.
yeah,
There's Seventh-day
now,
Baptists. There's Messianics. I like the Messianics. I just like their
right.
because it honors kind of the culture. Although I don't, I this is I wanted to read you this one thing like in context here, like with this whole idea. Like so many people just don't like that idea I was saying
Well,
about the
yeah,
tabernacle.
and let me
Yeah,
just say first that
yeah,
having said that, I want to give a follow up, which is that while I do um, accept that most probably that the Sabbath is in effect forever, that I'm probably not in full agreement with many SDAs in that it has to be on Saturday. And what I mean by that is that uh, to 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 follow a denomination and saying this is the day that's designated as the Sabbath, this was the original Sabbath, you have to rest on this day. That's where you get on shaky grounds because throughout history, the many different calendars have been instituted, and and this goes into the exact day that Jesus was born. Some people say he was born in the spring. Some people say no, it was December. Um, a a psychic once, a notable psychic, said in a reading once when he was asked about it, he said that in one calendar. And by the way, I don't, I take it with a grain of salt, but a lot of information that he relayed from his readings were later proven to be true. So he said that going by, depending on which calendar you go by, Jesus was born either on March 19th, 4 BC, or December 25th, uh, 5 BC, or somewhere either the year prior or the year after, I forget. Because it got changed to the
I think
Gregorian.
you got it right. I think it's when you if you believe it was it's related to Hanukkah or whatever or more in December 25th or whatever.
Yeah,
You're going to do IBC to get the right dating for that sort of thinking,
yeah,
and then
but I mean, all
I
things
think a
being
lot of the 4 BC though is a thing that was kind of strained by the idea that the majority of scholars thought that Herod died in a particular year, and we need Jesus to be born before he dies, obviously, right? Because he goes to try to kill him for 2 years.
right.
It's 2 years. But I think did you something I found is that the majority thing is actually changing now, and it's saying Herod probably died in 2 or 1 BC based on the solar eclipse that is associated with his death, according to Josephus, and some other arbitrariness about the claim that he had to die in, like he died in 4 BC, and so that view has been shifting, and because of that evidence I
Oh,
just
okay.
mentioned, it's very interesting because of Revelation 12 is a very particular day, and by the way, that September 11 3 BC date happens to fall on Tishri 1, which is the new year on the Jewish calendar.
Oh,
and it
interesting.
doesn't land on Tishri 1, September 11 every time. So that star date that would land and is a acceptable year for Jesus' birth. Because the only thing that really constrains his age is that it says he's about 30 in a certain range. So 3 BC is within a reasonable range of him being within a year of 30 years old in Tiberius's reign, 15th year of reign in 27 AD.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's a 2-year. Sorry, I won't go into that. I'll go ahead.
Yeah, it's certainly it's interesting to look into that. But I mean, if there's compelling evidence to show that it is Saturday, the same Saturday that we have based on our current calendar, then all things being equal, then I would encourage Christians to arrange to rest on that day. You're gonna rest it anyway. I understand some people just work off.
One thing I will say this is, if you go deep dive into this thing, yes, they changed the calendar and all that, and like they even removed days and stuff. But when they did that, the day after Monday was still Tuesday, so it only removes calendar days from the calendar, even when they took out whole like weeks out of like October, I think a certain year, right? But the fact of the matter is, because of the way this is what's so interesting about God saying, and there's people that try to make it a lunar weekly Sabbath, which doesn't make sense because you have to like make a longer week, every so often, and it messes it up. But God only said about the Sabbath is it's a 7-day cycle, period, end of story. So that means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Sabbath, start over, recur, and that's all it says. So that when they try to make all this weird stuff with it, just totally ignore it. But the thing with removing days, the thing that we know is that, especially with the Jews, right, keeping the Sabbath and being dispersed, there's no, how do you think about how would that happen like in time? Like you just keep 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a Sabbath, and you got a whole community, and it's like no matter what they do to the calendar, the next day is still whatever day is the next day according to the Sabbath, because they counted 1 to the Sabbath, 2 to the Sabbath, and then the Sabbath day, and then start over. Like that just keeps continuing the 7-day week, no matter what days are removed from the calendar. So if you actually think that through, there's no doubt in anybody's mind or anybody scholarly that talks about this or anything. And I've looked into it. Nobody really can make it. It's kind of just like a first thought. You was like, well, they up the calendar. Like, how do we know it's the Saturdays? It's actually the Sabbath. And like, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. There's no discrepancy. There's like, oh, somebody over here is claiming, no, this is Saturday. No, that everybody has always just known what day it was because of the way it works. So there is no question that we know what day it is. It's one of those things hard to like wrap your mind around at first. You think, oh, if they messed up the calendar, how would we know? And it's because it was a continuous 7-day cycle, and many people are, what else is interesting? And I wanted to I'm trying to do a study on this. I'm just not sure how to like pull all the data together to make a presentation on it. But and I've asked this on like some of the higher end channels where they have like high end scholars being interviewed, and I've asked this like on Converse Contenders channel, and I think I asked John Walton on Sentinel Apologetics when he's being interviewed, and they never have a good answer because they're all like old earthers, right? But they're like, I asked, can you explain how if you take the Bible like is true, how is the Sabbath such an important thing in the Old Covenant, at least? If we have, according to secular, archaeology, the Babylonians are older than the Sumerians are older than Israel or the Hebrews, and they show a 7-day week. And even in their language, the 7th day is a form. It's like Sabado or Sabata and stuff like that. Even the Babylonians, it has Sabbath, sound to it, the 7th day. And they even write about it being a special day, and it's a 7-day week.
Oh, interesting.
And so if it's true that like that means God would have had to just adopt it, or did he give it to these older cultures, or is the earth young and he gave the Sabbath at the very beginning of creation and that spread to the nations from Babel?
Right.
So it's a great argument for like, if you actually take the Bible seriously, it's hard to get out of this. Like Rob Rowe told me, it was a polemic because he's an old earther. And I'm just thinking like, oh, really? God borrowed it from this other culture, and then he calls Israel, and then he claims he established it when he created the heavens and the earth, and then he like takes it really seriously and declares it
Yeah,
holy
yeah.
because he rested.
The day age interpretation gets you in a lot of tough spots.
This is one of the greatest arguments for young earth creationism, and I always tell that to young earth creationism, like, you guys, if you're a young earth creationist, you should be all about the Sabbath. The whole world has a 7-day week today. And why? Because God did it. God did it. And like, that's just one of the greatest arguments for young earth, if you think about it.
Yeah, yeah. Even going back to your debate with Smokey on the Sabbath, that's where you gain the most momentum for your position, is when you challenged him to answer the question, which of the 10 commandments can a Christian utterly abandon and still be saved? Well, the answer is obviously none. You can't utterly abandon any of them. Sure, you're going to fall short from time and again, but because you have a repentant heart, you're always going to want to do your best to keep it. And certainly the Holy Spirit guides us into how we should keep it, and strengthens our morale and our moral compass to do just that. So, I
wish I
if
could get
I
that debate over, man. I didn't get enough time to prepare, and like I let him like get me flustered with the whole like. But he was lying about my position so much of that time, saying I don't get it, how it's about love and stuff, and it's like, that's absolutely not true. And he's never argued that before when we talked about it. I know Kenny gave him that argument, but he was totally misrepresenting me, and that really made me mad, because I'm like, dude, that's not actually true. I actually agree with that. But he was trying to make it out like this contrast, and it really irritated me because it was dishonest.
Okay.
But
yeah, I mean, I can see how you can tie the theme of love as being the undertone for the Sabbath, and certainly it is.
the
Love
law of
for
God was always God's love,
right,
because God is love, and this is a
right,
reflection of his character.
right. The love that is the love that God has for man, the love that man has for God, and the love that men ought to have, between one another. And so, to a Christian, I would encourage them to, if they're not observing the Sabbath at all, I would try to encourage them to at least start by picking a day that's convenient. I know that some jobs aren't exactly conducive to picking the precise day that you want to have off, but at least for a starter, try to pick a specific day and designate that as being a rest day. And then, all things being equal, try to navigate it to Saturday if possible.
Yeah,
and that's
I agree with that.
I think that's really the issue of the in the debate between you and Smokey is how stringent should we take the Sabbath, and how much flexibility how much flexibility should there be in how one observes the Sabbath? That's really the difference that I see.
Yeah, you can get bogged down with like the minutia of like what's appropriate or not.
You're roboting a little bit.
Oh, are you like? Can you hear me now? Maybe your phone's dying. I would say, yeah, it's real easy to get bogged down with the minutia of like the rules, but I think that's where you want to try to avoid getting bogged down.
Right.
You want to say
right.
like that's what happened that went wrong, that Jesus was rebuking them for. So it's like, don't get overly worried about all that. Just like, I mean, I think what Mike Banner has said is for the most part pretty good. Like, it's like, don't make people work on it. If you employ people, you don't do it. Like God says, I think that one verse, I forget where it is. If it's Isaiah, it's one of the Isaiah verses, but it says like, if you stop treading on my Sabbath, or if you turn foot from my Sabbath, meaning you've been you treading on it, like not taking it, honoring it, and you turn to God, and you don't do the things that that about you, and you turn to me on that day, I will bless you and, make you ride upon the high places, just for the fact that, so like, there's a lot of blessings associated with it. Of course, that's in the old covenant, but I don't see why that'd be any different. It was said to be the sign that I am the Lord, your God that sanctifies you, because it's the sign that you're saying this is a God that created the universe, who rested on the first seventh day and tells us to do it after him. So you're like honoring him as creator very specifically. So that's where it gets more than just a moral issue. But I think you're right. Like, I know a lot of people are Sabbatarian, but they keep Sunday, which I think is largely fade of style, because nobody accepts that, almost, because it's like, the authority of Scripture never changed the day. It's kind of an artifact of history that people were keeping it. But it's funny when you read even into the 1800s, all the people that came out of the Reformation and its sister movements, that not Catholic, in other words, Western Christianity, they kept, everybody was calling Sunday the Sabbath, even until the 1900s. I think Adventism almost kind of like made that change, right? It's almost like the realization that Sunday is not the Sabbath, like if you go by the Bible, people either, for the most part, stopped calling Sunday the Sabbath, which was just kind of common parlance. And then in a way, many groups, like, rather than just honor the Sabbath, they kind of invented all these weird, not good doctrines, like, oh, we're not under the law, therefore we don't keep the law. And now, like, so many people are so confused. I have to wonder, because no one was saying stuff like that until like 100 years ago, right? That, like, we're not under the law. Nobody said that. It was like, they were always like, no, we keep the commandments, God's commandments. Those are obviously moral laws that reflect who God is. Like, people knew that. And I just wonder if this, if Seventh Day Sabbath movements kind of pushed people into that. But like, so I just think it's like an issue it's just an interesting historical thing, like
it is.
The way it went. But the question is, like, there's really no record of anybody not keeping the Sabbath until like 150 AD, which is pretty early, obviously, right? But it was like a mix. And then more as the church spread out, it appears to me, from my understanding, there's not a lot of good history on this per se, like where you can really tally up who was and who wasn't. But whatever I can see is in the scholarship is like, there's really no claim of, church fathers saying anything about Sunday until like in the mid 100s, maybe a little bit earlier, but still well after Revelation was written. And so to me, that's just that the early church was keeping the Sabbath. Why wouldn't they? They're arguing about circumcision, right? Like whether or not the Gentiles coming in should be circumcised. And that was like a whole to-do, right, in the Council of Jerusalem. But if that's the case, you're telling me no one was like, wouldn't somebody have been like, if Paul meant, in Romans 14 or in Colossians that let's not keep one of the 10 commandments anymore, that somebody wouldn't have been like objecting and saying like, what do we're not keeping the Sabbath. It was just done away with, even though the church was like, established in Jerusalem, and like the Jews had all these rules to protect it because God had like, essentially for not keeping this, honoring his Sabbaths, whether it be yearly or weekly, like they would be punished. And that's part of the reason they had set up all these rules to protect it. Right. But that was totally the wrong way to go about it. And Jesus rebuked them. But like to think he would have, they took it really seriously. And it's still, we see that today with Jews in Israel. It's like they get serious, and to think nobody would have spoken up when yet other people were speaking up about circumcision is this is like logically like untenable to think. So in other words, I think they were just obviously keeping the Sabbath, continue to keep the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments, and
right.
If they hadn't been,
now,
or somebody would just change it, somebody would have spoken up, and we'd be reading about that at the Council of Jerusalem. I find that very persuasive, to be honest, because it's like, come on, like to me, that's like, that's why I'll never change my mind on this. And it's like,
and just to address the other point that Ken Hovind brings up on the question of the Sabbath, which is a valid point, but I think there's a logical response to it. Kent says that when when Peter was conferring with the Christians on receiving the Gentile brothers in Christ that were being converted into the congregation, he only prescribed four laws for them to keep. No, don't fornicate,
Eat
don't
things
for
strangled, meat
right,
strangled,
yeah.
sexual fornication.
Basically, that the Sabbath isn't in it. And what I would say to that is that he is really just working them in, getting them, um, allowing them to assimilate into the lifestyle of abiding under God's laws in a way that isn't uncomfortable or intrusive. Easing them on in. That's the best response I can give. But just because he only mentions four laws, it doesn't mean that you forget all the rest.
Yeah, do they
And
have to like not keep idols and like like
right,
murder
yeah,
people?
obviously they couldn't break that. Yeah, so he was just giving a brief summation, I would say, as to getting them started on their walk of sanctification. And when they get to that certain point where they uh, are up to the task, have that yearning to have that higher degree of fellowship with God, then obviously they're gonna it's gonna be like they'll be like as if they were on autopilot. They'll automatically navigate to that point where they serve the Sabbath and every other law, not perfectly, and obviously not to keep themselves saved, but it's just a manifestation of the a fruit of their
Yes.
regeneration,
Yeah,
is what I
I
would
think
say.
that's exactly right. If you read the commentaries on that, I think there's people who argue for that kind of view, but it's like, look, that's so. I mean, that to me, that's like just evidence that people aren't really wanting the truth on this. They just want to kind of stay where they're at. And I'm not even trying to like overly judge them per se. I would just say like, if you look into it, the context, what people have read about it, the way that I forget where they were, Colossia or Galatia or Corinth or whatever, but those people I think were probably less familiar with the law, and those things that they mention tell them to refrain from meat strangled, fornication, and whatever the other things were. It's like not to eat the blood or whatever, and then another one. It's like that was the things they did in their culture in that region, if I recall what it says in like commentaries, or it may even suggest that in the text. And then you look at it, it's like the context is that these Gentiles, presumably ones that weren't familiar with the culture of, the absolute, things to refrain from, according to God, they mentioned those because they're the ones that like those people did in that region. So in other words, tell them they need to not do these things that they do there, and then they'll learn the rest, come to the synagogue or come to the gatherings on the Sabbath and hear Moses or whatever. They may not be in that context either. I can't remember for sure, but that's mentioned
Yeah,
elsewhere. They're pouring in. Just tell them for now. Like, what are we going to do with all these people pouring in that have all these weird practices? Well, tell them they got to stop doing that.
exactly. Right. Yeah. So I think it's pretty the way I see it, it's pretty clear on the issue of the Sabbath. We should keep it to our best ability, just as we should keep to our best ability every law. As a conditionalist, it gets tricky and say, well, if you keep breaking it, eventually your salvation is going to be threatened. And I would say yes, but it's a difference between violating the laws in open defiance versus stumbling in the law on your walk of repentance. It's repentance is the key component here, and that's where the preacher goes off, is that he's operating on a different concept of repentance. Repent once and never again. That's basically what he was telling me the other night.
Oh,
So
I thought they were just arguing at praises, right? I mean, I'm just like,
yeah,
oh man.
Yeah,
How do you
and
deal
that's
with that? And that's what I'm against right there, what Paul was doing. And I
yeah,
felt bad
that's how you undermine his position is you prove from the text that repentance means only one thing, and that it's a continuous thing. It's not just you repent once and then you're commanded to stop. He builds his entire doctrine on that. That's the the backbone of his theology. And all you have to do is just undermine that, and all the rest of it crumbles. And that's what I've been contemplating on throughout today and uh, whenever I have spare time in in my recent in the recent period in which I've had the opportunity to contemplate on this, because I've never really dealt with a full blown antinomian. Like Charles, you could say he's somewhat of a closet antinomian.
right.
So it was
Just
interesting. It was interesting seeing those two go at it. They were arguing, kind of in a petty kind of way. Say, well, no, what Charles was saying, why can't I still go to heaven even if I worship Satan? And he was the preacher was saying, you don't. It's not sin. You need to do these things and not have that searing of the conscience, or else you will lose your salvation. So they were arguing semantics about what sin is and what repentance is, and why still can't he go to because a lot of it overlaps, and it was entertaining in one way, but
I
also
missed that.
and
Where was this? I got to see that.
yeah, it was on Praise's channel the last just the other night, just
2 nights ago.
on Thursday night.
Okay,
It
because that
didn't go
sounds
on.
hilarious. I love
Yeah, it
it
didn't go
when
on
that.
for very long because they were supposed to have timed responses, but the preacher kept interrupting him, and then Charles got aggravated and insult. He started throwing. The preacher started throwing insults, and then Charles just busted out a rap at him, and
That's nice.
and that was that. But that's why I recommended the Praise tonight to see if he can hold a formal debate between those two, because I think it'd be quite enjoyable. I think it'd be edifying in strengthening the doctrine of those who are true Christians, in letting them become better equipped at knowing where they're coming from, so that we know how best to respond to their arguments, and the latter part being for, I guess, entertainment value. It'll be funny to see them argue between these
right.
minuscule.
It's funny, but it's sad in a way, right? But it's entertaining.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just glad that Praise did that, because I think it drove him back to the truth that he had already known regarding these issues. Because he was starting to say stuff like, we had been talking for a long time, and he'd come to this conclusion, kind of on his own with some of his own research, like with the apodictic thing about the nature of the moral commands. And I really want to make a video on that, by the way, because I think the Euthyphro dilemma and the William Lane Craig argument about God, the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma being that God is who he is, and that's where morals come from, not that that they're good and so he does them, and also not that he just arbitrarily commands them, but that they stem from who he is. So the Euthyphro dilemma fails, and it answers it. The moral comes from God, who God is. And if that's true and God doesn't change, if there's one way he doesn't change, that would be one of the ways you'd have to say he does not change. And so all sorts of issues arise if you think that he can just arbitrarily change his nature or something. So that alone right there tells you that that's a philosophical, ironclad argument.
Yeah.
For the perpetuity of the moral laws being.
It was it was interesting seeing Praise leveraging arguments against the preacher in a way that was that had a conditionalist undertone to them, and Praise probably didn't realize it, but that so.
Sorry, I clicked you out for a second, but I didn't miss anything.
Oh no, it's cool. Yeah, so it's
right.
So yeah, I agree with you that there are certain elements to the true doctrine that once you've come to realize it as being true, or just convinced to the point where your conviction drives you to take it with a heavy consideration that it's always going to stick with you. And so I think that's what happened there. But
you shall know the
I
truth
also
and
wanted
you'll
to,
set you free.
yeah,
It means more than one thing. It means that thy law is truth and Jesus is the truth, but that's all intertwined together.
that's right. Um, Now, I wanted to go over, and by the way, is the formal debate between you and SFT still on at the moment, or
I don't know. He doesn't contact me, and I don't have his number in my WhatsApp, so I don't have any way to contact him. But I'm waiting to hear from him. If you talk to him, yeah, just tell him to email me or to send me a WhatsApp.
Oh, okay. No, I was just wondering. Yeah. So I was saying in the chat before, this is for me, this is a much highly anticipated debate. And I didn't realize it at first, but SFT mentioned it in his last conversation with you, which was that you and him have had this conversation multiple times over the past a year, maybe even more than a year. I got the impression that you and him have spoke about this matter even before I arrived in this community, and so so it's not just me. Then it's many people that have witnessed this ongoing discussion on the topic of Daniel 9 that are highly anticipating a formal debate between you and him. It would be the first of its kind, I think.
I'm thinking about it every day. So here's what I think he means by that. So he's trying to kind of, to be honest, it feels like from my perspective, it seems like he's kind of posturing in the sense that like, oh, you don't even have this worked out. Like I've been telling you, my view's been out there for a long time, and I don't disagree with that. That's true. But like I'm saying, like I keep focusing on, look, man, like you don't know about historicism and the differences, it seems, and so like your whole schema, I get it, like you have it all laid out dealing with all the text, and that's good to do that. But I've been saying this whole time from the start, like it feels like you're basically a pre-trib but denying it, and then it feels kind of it doesn't make sense to me that you want to have a 70th week in the future for Israel when your theology does not acknowledge a dispensational view. All that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's like, and that actually makes sense because I think Steven Anderson didn't really like receive, his system from like a tradition, right? So he probably took from here or there how he read it, not realizing every little detail. Is kind of a little bit grab bag, if you will, if you get what I'm saying, or cafeteria style. And so
yeah,
I just realized like why it doesn't make sense for him to even try to posit that there's a future 70th week for Israel when most Baptist theology of that or NIFB wouldn't really need to feel that. In other words, I think the 70th week only really makes sense to be cast off if you think God's trying to fulfill something with Israel separate from the church. But Baptists of that sort don't really want to make that separation. And I don't really see what the point is. But then, of course, I've heard Steven Anderson's arguments. He makes the arguments that everybody's trying to use against me, which is, well, Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, is talking about the end of the daily sacrifice and the daily in the other one, and on both sides of it. And it's like, so of course it takes away the Daniel 9. Well, here's the thing. That actually is like a conceptually good argument, but look, what is the focus of the Bible? Jesus. What is Jesus? He makes atonement for sin. He makes a way to save the world. We should start there, like that our focus, because the focus is Jesus is Messiah, and we shouldn't take that for granted. Jesus said, "It is written, have you not read?" We should be. So he made it very clear that things must be established from the written word of God. Okay, it's so easy for us to just take it for granted. Jesus is Messiah. But no, they had to make that case from the scriptures, according to the scriptures. And so, and then people aren't looking at the reason why it happens on certain dates with the Jubilee cycles. They ignore that. And, I made a little thing today. It's like, look, if you hate open theists and you say the 70th week was put on hold and now it's going to be in the future, it seems really open theisty to me, as if God had to put it on pause. Like what? Because he didn't know that like it wouldn't work out. But so when it
Yeah,
didn't,
yeah, I get where yeah, believe me, I get exactly where you're coming from. Sometimes when I look at the text, seeing how different interpreters try to convey what's uh, in the text based on their interpretation, it kind of it makes me wonder at times whether um, the the prophecies of the Old uh, Testament are even inclusive of what later unfolded that led to the new covenant. And if you just go by the plain reading of the text, there is no there is no contradiction in my honest opinion. But I can see where you're coming from. That if that putting the 70th week way far out in the future gives the antagonist, or I should say the atheist, the leeway to say, you see, they had to make things up as they went along because such and such didn't happen, so they had to work with what they, work with what they had and made things turn out differently, and we are now forced to having to reconcile the two, and to having to do mental gymnastics here and there to make things tie together. But I can see where you're coming from, but overall, I'm still not convinced either way. I see altogether at the moment, I see a greater weight of evidence in favor of interpreting the Daniel 9:27 as being the enemy that's
sure.
establishing the covenant. However, the what you've offered is also coherent. In other words, what you've offered so far, under examination, I haven't been able to find any contradiction within itself, and also measured against Scripture, because there are a lot of areas where it overlaps, and that's what I wanted to offer to you tonight, so that you can get a broad. And by the way, because I'm still familiarizing myself with a lot of these theological terms, what does it mean to be a dispensationalist?
There's different ways you can mean it. Okay, obviously there, and the people obscure it by pointing out the fact that there's everybody's a dispensationalist because that word's in the Bible, and like God implements different covenants and ways in that sense, right? Just different dispensations of like applying His grace, or making people right with Him. But what I mean usually is that, like, essentially I'm meaning like that you're the dispensation of grace is like somehow a different mode of salvation in the church age or something, and then before, like, God, it wasn't by grace or faith, or you could kind of like speak into the idea that the church and Israel are totally separate. And so I think that's one of the main
Oh, I
bases
see.
of foundational
Okay.
bases. Like, do you think the new covenant was? I look at it like I'm a covenant theologist, which would be kind of the opposite. That's kind of the main difference. So that would mean, and this is classically what the church has been historically, like in some form or another, like by vast majority, if not completely. And that is, the covenant came to Israel. The new covenant was promised to Israel through Jesus. Jesus performs that. And then then the Gentiles are brought in to Christ. And so the covenant, there's just one covenant between God and man. And true replacement theology was to say, like, God totally cast away the Jews and made this church with Gentiles, which is totally just arbitrary, and people run with that, and they don't even really, until like 50 years ago, almost the vast majority of Christians didn't even think of Jesus as a Jew until about 50 years ago. It started to change, right? And so it's like, that's true replacement theology, right? But reality is that the church is Jewish. It was established with the first covenant people, and then the Gentiles are grafted in, not to become Jews as we understand them now, but that God established it with His covenant people as promised, as the Old Testament scriptures were written for them. I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and I'll write my laws on their hearts, and everybody, and then it prophesies that everybody
Right.
will know the Lord. And so the main thing with dispensation is, there's weaker and stronger forms, but they're basically want to say, like, Israel is like a separate thing. different covenant. Some of them go
Okay,
so as
I see.
far as to say
Okay.
Jesus didn't even establish a covenant yet. He just did this other thing and died for the Gentiles. It gets really weird.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds weird. I definitely don't hold to that. I think Romans 11 speaks pretty strongly
That the Jews are separate.
against that, right?
But
But
yeah, I'm open to that idea that the Jews are separate in a certain sense, but there's only one gospel of salvation. It went to the Jew first,
right,
established the
right,
body.
exactly. Yeah.
I was thinking about, because I know like you're struggling with this, and like I don't want to try to like push you or force you into it. And I can tell like this is the way you've been always understood it, probably from what you've learned about these prophecies, and it is the common view. And so I'm trying to think of like a way to kind of draw out why I think this is so
Well,
important.
I actually I took notes and that's what I wanted to give you tonight,
Oh
so
yeah,
you get a better understanding of where I'm coming from. And these points obviously may not even get brought up if you have a formal debate with SFT, but from what I've been able to gather from the text in Daniel and from everything that I've been able to um, sum up in my contemplations, I just wrote them down in these itemized points that leads me um, to have a higher confidence in the traditional interpretation. So the first point is that let me see. Okay, so you know how you've mentioned about uh, how the text can be referring to the immediate antecedent subject that's brought up, so that he could be referring to the Messiah, more likely referring to Messiah than not. And so to that, the reason why I don't find that to be more compelling than the overall context laid out in the latter chapters of Daniel is the fact that the Messiah, the Prince, and the little horn, or the beast, or the Prince, the Antichrist, they're already mentioned. So they're these two characters have already been established in the narrative, even in Daniel chapter 7, going into chapter 8. And so just because you have Messiah the Prince, for me personally, just because I see Messiah the Prince, and then it goes into, and he and the people, the Prince that shall come, and he shall do this and this. For me, it doesn't necessarily have to refer back to Messiah the Prince, because you have this continuous narrative going from chapter to chapter, and you already have the Prince that's mentioned that is in that is contending with Messiah the Prince, and you have these two opposite forces fighting one against another, and that's what I see in Daniel 9:27 or 26 rather, which is that you have Messiah the Prince, and then this other prince that comes along causes a desolation by means of the overspreading of abominations, and that is what leads to the war that causes the temple to be the city to be destroyed. And so you have that the war there, and that's and that they are adversaries to one another. And an extension to that point would be that there are multiple princes. So mentioned, Messiah the Prince, Gabriel, I'm sorry, Michael the Prince, Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece. And so it's there are many princes mentioned there. And so because you have all these characters already laid out in this story that's being told, this prophecy, the fact that the desolation occurs by means of a war, which entails opposing forces leads me to a greater confidence that this is referring back to the little horn that shall magnify himself even to the Messiah, the prince of the host. The next point is that the covenant, and this is probably one of the strongest points for me personally, which is that I understand you've laid out the case that the covenant is the new covenant that Christ establishes, and I understand where you're coming from completely. And even now, I'm open to the possibility that that may be correct. However, for the time being, I see a greater weight of evidence to interpret that covenant as referring strictly to a treaty in which the animal sacrifice will be allowed for that week-long period, or in other words, the 7-year period, in the middle of which the prince will cause it to stop. And this is because while Jesus certainly did institute a new covenant, if it was the writer's intention to convey to the reader that it is a new covenant that is being established by God for the purpose of replacing the first old covenant, then I think it would be more coherent for him to say, to call it just that, a new covenant, or the next covenant, the second covenant, something to delineate that covenant as being a successor of the first one. Rather, it just says covenant. And therein lies the problem for someone that holds to your interpretation, in my opinion, which is that if you go strictly by Daniel and not use any of the books from the New Testament, if you go strictly by the book of Daniel or any other book, even if you go by Isaiah or anywhere in the Old Testament that pertains to this part of the narrative in the prophetic sense, is that the covenant there is only mentioned in connection with the animal sacrifice. And so in order to interpret the covenant as referring to the new covenant, which Christ did establish, then you're having to use something outside of Daniel, going from the new covenant and superimposing that onto Daniel, which, like I said, is not a deal breaker for me. But because you are confined to having to do that, I see this as being a greater weight of evidence in favor of the traditional interpretation. And furthermore, concerning the covenant, is that if Christ established the new covenant, we all agree with that. The covenant that's being established by whoever the he is in Daniel 9:27, it says that he's only establishing it for a week. And so if you use the New Testament to overlap the covenant in Daniel chapter 9, as well as, like I said, chapter 7, 8, 9, and 11, then you have somewhat of a wrench in your gears, where in the New Testament, the new covenant that Jesus established is referred to as an everlasting covenant between God says it's an everlasting covenant between him and Israel. And of
not
course,
according to their obedience, but according to his mercy.
True. Yeah.
Which is what Daniel asked about in Daniel 9, what he's praying.
Yeah.
Okay, go. Yeah, continue. I want to speak to the last point you made, because I think that's one of the key issues here.
Yeah.
I'm coming to realize that, like, in trying to be fair, and I appreciate talking to you about it because you're so calm and like trying really hard to be fair because I'm so passionate about it. This is the issue, that interpretive point. But I think I have some good arguments for that. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So that's that. Yeah. So in the in several places in the New Testament, it's especially in the book of Hebrews, it's an everlasting covenant that I see. In other words, whenever this new covenant is spoken of in the New Testament, I consistently find it being qualified as an everlasting covenant. rather than a week-long covenant. In other words, there's nothing in the New Testament that I was able to find referring to the covenant as having occurred only within a 7-year or 1 week time span, in, let alone in literal reference to the prophecy of Daniel. And
that screams of the fact that you've heard this text from only a particular group or like from perspective, because like, and CJ is the same way. Like he's like, I don't get it. Like if he confirmed the covenant by his blood, like what is this week? Or how is it for a week? And like, it's like, you could translate it. He strengthens the covenant. And if you're coming at it from the perspective of it being the new covenant, it's because his ministry, seeing that those other views don't associate, they just want to associate his death. And so his teaching, though, wasn't just as important, right? About what they were getting wrong about the law, essentially, right? And putting all these walls around it. So his ministry was very important. And it marks by his baptism and with the Jubilee cycles and the Shemitah cycles, which is very key and critical. And not a lot of people have written on this. And I think it's what totally just makes it solid. But the idea is that his teaching is supposed to be for that week. And the reason it's a week is because of the time frame of when he would come. It's not so much about covenant's time frame, other than the time that he comes to teach and make it happen and teach it, but he's cut off in the middle of it. So in other words, it's just talking about that last 7 years as being the final period of the 70 weeks.
I get where you're saying. It's just that in order to
so it absolutely is everlasting. So
if there were a single mention of the new covenant as being established by Jesus for a week anywhere or 7 years in the New Testament, then you could absolutely say conclusively that the writers of the New Testament Gospels were absolutely had this same understanding, and from what I've been able to find is that there is no the new covenant was never qualified, has never been qualified in the New Testament as being something that Jesus established for a week, and so I suppose it's possible that they weren't aware of it, but again,
they were. I would say, but there's also no 7 years for the future Antichrist either, particularly. But consider, if you read it with this in mind and you read Luke 3, like they were clearly counting the time till Messiah. But of course, you don't have to have the 70th week. If you think it's after the 69th week, you could still count to the 69th. But see, Standing for Truth doesn't even see that. It says know and understand from the decree until Messiah is 7 and 62. It's like, what are you supposed to know and understand if all these periods are split up and like put off in different places and we don't know for sure? Why does it give you a start date and tell you to know and understand when the start date is? And then it tells you from that until Messiah is 62 and 7. It's like, once people go off the rails with these time period gaps, and then they start saying, well, we don't even have this 62 attached from the decree to the Messiah. Now you've really gone off the rails, because now you're just like, the 7, like I heard him say last time, like the 7 years is like the 7 years during the temple being destroyed, the Jewish war, and like the first 7 for somehow. But it says there's 7 and then there's 62, and it says know and understand. That means you're supposed to know about the decree and you're supposed to understand the decree. That's what the text tells you: know and understand. But I guess on those views, doesn't really matter. Most people who take your 70th week being the Antichrist in the future or at least try to make a case for a certain, like 444, and then they have to make the years 360-day years, and then to try to make it land right on Jesus going into Jerusalem on the donkey.
And that's where I'm not equipped to address about the the 360-day year and all of that, the calendar thing.
Yeah, this is where my view shines. That's where my view is right, because we know they used my calendar that I'm advocating for, a true seasonal year. And guess what? The decree that I'm saying is the historic beginning of a jubilee, which is a 49 period. We know the prophecy is 10 of those in a row, and so the 10th jubilee wouldn't be complete unless the 70th week happens, right after the 69th, because it's the last Shemitah cycle of the 10th jubilee from the decree. And when you take that off, now you don't have that Jubilee being fulfilled. And then also, those happen on certain years, on a cycle. My view puts Jesus in the last 7 years of the 10th Jubilee of the prophecy from that period, which is the beginning of a Jubilee cycle. And then 10 Jubilees later would end in 34. And Jesus cut off right in the middle of that last 7 Shemitah. And they were punished according to their disobedience of the Shemitah cycle. And so he gives them 10 Jubilee cycles for this stuff to happen. And then the last thing I'll say is this on that is that when you realize that, and then you realize that the prophecy was given to the Jews so that they would count the years according to how they're supposed to, and we know how they did, and they did it seasonally, which it's a varying amount of days per year, but it kept them year to year on tact. And we know the New Testament says they recognized the time of the Messiah because they were expecting the Messiah, in my opinion, right? It's pretty clear. It's an acceptable year of the Lord when he comes out of the temple. That this is according to the Jubilee and the Shemitah cycles that you say that sort of thing is associated with the acceptable year of the Lord, right? Because the year they let the captives go free, because that's when they let debts go free, right? On the Jubilee cycles and the associated with this. And he's saying, like, I'm come to do that. And he's like, now it's been fulfilled. And he's baptized right then. So, sorry, last thing is just that when you realize they didn't convert 360-day years, that's totally false and not historically accurate. And so my view actually uses the calendar they used and is associated with that the Jubilee punishments, like 70 and then 70 times 7 is the 490 years, because he's in Babylon for 70. And then he finds out there's 490 years appointed by God, which is the 70 times 7 thing. 70 and then 70 times 7. You see that in the Old Testament. You see Jesus say that about forgiveness. And that what is he that he's accomplishing? Forgiveness for sins to the everlasting covenant promised to Abraham. And so that is the everlasting covenant. So in other words, those cycles, it goes right on that. In my view, it actually uses it according to the way they actually did Jubilee cycles. And it lands right on the 7s on those within the cycle system. So to me, that's just conversation's over. Because once you recognize that, and that lands perfectly within that, how they actually used it, no convoluted, messing with the days and trying to make it exactly a real year, trying to figure that out. The calendar will mess you up with that, trying to get it just right. And it still can't land. Even there's only 4 possible decrees. And they try to do it with the 444 and shrink the years down. But then that ignores the fact that he confirms a covenant for a week and all that. Sorry, I'm getting all over the place, but go ahead.
No, it's okay. No, I appreciate that. So if you can, seeing that you're able to respond to these points coherently, tells me that you can contend on this position, and you can make a very compelling case, I think. And so like I was saying, for me personally, it was just the covenant thing, the time span, week-long covenant versus an everlasting covenant. The week-long covenant, so far as I was able to find, is only referred to as being week-long in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 9, and nowhere else. So that.
Why do they say the covenant's a week long? I reject that interpretation outright. I just think he strengthens the covenant
or established it. Yeah, that he made the covenant with
many. By
many.
his death is what does it, and we know that's what happened. We should read this thing here in Hebrews, because I want to speak to that. Because think about this, Paul. There's a promise of a new covenant through Messiah, right? In the Old Testament, in Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Paul quotes it twice in Hebrews here. And listen to this, so think about the idea that the temple is going to come back according to the text after the new covenants had come in light of this. He's saying, look, the old temple system couldn't get it done. They had to come in year after year. But a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, did not.
Okay, I see it. This is Hebrews 4, I think. Hebrews 4. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm on mute this whole time. Sorry, buddy. Yeah, Hebrews 8. Yeah, like listen to this language. He's saying the temple system's over, like as far as being appropriate. Like, so, we have such a high priest on the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. And then I'm not skipping anything for any particular reason. I'm just trying to get through it quick. He talks about how the other ones were on earth, had to do things for themselves, but they serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle, the portable one in the wilderness. For see, saith he, that thou make all the things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. So he's making it after the one in heaven, the pattern of the one in heaven, so God could dwell with man on earth. And so we have now obtained a more excellent ministry, that is a better covenant, which establishes.
I don't have a problem with any of this. This is all. I'm in agreement with all of this. It's just whenever I read, he shall establish, it reads, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So you have 2 ways to go about it. It's either that he is doing the action of confirming the covenant for 1 week, which sounds like is where you're coming from, or alternatively, you could say that he makes an agreement with the many for the period of just 1 week. Now, obviously, you have to confine yourself to the former, to the first interpretation, which is that he's doing the confirming of the new covenant for a time span of 1 week, and so when you do that, you're having to take an extra step to accommodate the fact that it's not just the Messiah, the Prince, that's doing it, but also his disciples. And then that's where I see an arbitrary cutoff line and say, okay, here's a 7-year mark and that's it, when actually it continues on. And so I see that in connection with the everlasting righteousness, which is that Christ began the work of bringing in the everlasting righteousness, starting from his work at Calvary. And from thereafter, you have the church that then spreads the gospel. And then and all of that culminates in the fruit, the house that is built up. In one way, it's God. In another way, it's discipleship. His disciples building it up from his 12 disciples, not including Judas, obviously the one that replaced him, and then going from the church, and then year after year, century after century, and it's growing. And then when Christ returns, that's the culmination of the work that he began at Calvary. That's how I see it at the moment. And so when you have to arbitrarily say, Jesus did the confirming himself for 3.5 years, and then his disciples finished off the last 3.5 years, is a weak point to me at the moment. Yes, you can make it work in a way.
Think about what the text says. It says, he confirms the covenant with many for 1 week, but in the midst of the week, he's cut off, but not for himself, or whatever. And so it sets you up for the fact that happened. And the whole point about the disciples going to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, once he dies, we know. So and I'll show you in this right here, in the next chapter, it says, look at this, which stood only in meat. So this relates to the Colossians verse, right? How Jesus did that. The meats and drinks and carnal ordinances opposed on them until the time of Reformation. This tells you that the things that he did away with in Colossians, this is speaking to that way. This is one of the main reasons I think Paul wrote this book too, because that sounds like Colossians. But so becoming a high priest, if Christ is the high priest, become the high priest. Well, what covenant with who had all these things that are comparing to Christ, right? If he's doing away with their temple system, and he told them he's leaving their house to them desolate before he even dies, right? And then we know their sins weren't only forgiven through Christ once he's dead, right? So his death, and now watch this. So you cannot disassociate Christ ending the temple system which is only for the Jews or the first covenant people. So we can't have in other words, to have the book of Hebrews and to say like this other thing is still going to happen with the Jews that's separate to our gospel or something doesn't make any sense, because he established the covenant by taking away the things that were regarded in the temple. And so now it's one thing if you take Daniel 8 or 11, like this is the thing, if you take Daniel 8 to be Antiochus Epiphanes, taking away the temple stuff, shouldn't that be typing Jesus' ministry? Because once Jesus comes, that system's taken away. So how would the Antichrist have such a one-to-one correlation from Daniel 8 with a future temple after the light of what Jesus has done? It's one thing if it's just talking about Antiochus, but if you want to associate that with the future Antichrist, he shouldn't be talking about the temple system again, because the temple system was a type of Jesus' ministry, which come to the Jew first. So like, it's one. So for like, if you're a preterist or something, you can make a better argument against mine. But the fact that if you want to say it's a type, why would you think it's a type of a literal temple once the literal temple has been removed? That's what's confusing to me. But no, this is the last thing on that I wanted to show you though. But look, for a testament this is the same word as a covenant, basically. Eternal inheritance, right? That's the Abraham thing. That's what he's praying for in the beginning of Daniel, the everlasting covenant promised to Abraham, according to his mercy, not his. And so what does Daniel 9:24 say? Well, those are the things Jesus does. So the immediate context is a vision. The angels come to explain according to Daniel's prayer. So you really shouldn't be drawing in Daniel 8 or Daniel 7 to the fact that Daniel's praying about his people. And then the angel specifically says, Daniel, I bring you good tidings regarding what you know about God's covenant promise to his people for mercy. And I'm coming to answer that prayer. And it's good news, Daniel, who's greatly beloved. Now, let me tell you what's going to happen. So this amount of times, because he wants to know when, right? This time is allotted to answer your prayer, that this is how it'll be answered. 90 years are appointed to your disobedient people, and it's for your people in your city. And this is what's going to happen for your people in your city. Everlasting righteousness. Nothing about anything an Antichrist would do, but good things that we know Jesus did, right? Establish righteousness, take away sins.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how can you draw in Daniel 8 just because of similar language? That's the big question, the looming question for your view or whatever, because like, I know that I get the Daniel 8 context, but come on, this is totally a new thing going on in the chapter 9. He's praying about getting right with God. The angel tells him it's about that. Then he says it's about your holy city. And we know Jesus did that. And when you look at Daniel 11, the one people bring 11:32 or whatever, it's like, if you go back into like verse 28, it's the covenant that's being spoken of is the holy covenant. And if you're going to say that Daniel 11 is about the future before Jesus comes, I mean, how can you call the covenant an Antichrist makes falsely in a false temple with the Jews or whatever? However, there's different ways to construct that, but it's not the holy covenant, is it?
I see. You're saying that if one goes by the traditional interpretation that it'd be problematic to call the covenant that the beast makes with the many being holy. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think people are a little confused on my position. Like, I don't think, because I think 9:27 is talking about Jesus and the new covenant. Therefore, I also think, I do think the covenant being spoken of is the one Jesus made that's being trampled on in the future. But I'm not saying Jesus.
Basically, you're saying that that the new covenant, which is a covenant by faith rather than by the animal sacrifice atonement, is better suited for the title of being holy rather than the one that the beast. Okay, I see. Yeah, I thought about that too.
And because it's future, and the only way to salvation is the new covenant that Jesus brought, this is describing, I agree that it's future and that that it's describing in terms written before Jesus accomplished the new covenant. So it's talking about it in terms that are associated with the first covenant, like the temple implements and the temple details, because those were types of Jesus' ministry, right, that he fulfilled, so they would recognize him. So when it talks about a future thing before Jesus returns, in the language pre-establishment of the new covenant, all the option there is to write about is in the language of the first covenant temple system. But when we understand that Jesus fulfilled that system and that it was typological about his ministry in the new covenant, we understand that it's future, and now so we should look at it like this Antichrist figure is obscuring the truth of that new covenant, because that's the only covenant of salvation, and this bad figure is actually trying to obscure the way of salvation, and that's why it's so dire and bad.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from.
Sorry, that was hard to explain. I'm trying to make sure I cross, because it's hard to get people to understand.
Because I thought about that as well. Why in Daniel 11 it's mentioned, it's regarded as the Holy Covenant, when the provisional explanation that I'm going by at the moment is that the covenant itself, even though it's a reflection of the old covenant rather than a new one, is still a holy covenant. In other words, that the covenant that he is allowing the Jews to practice is holy, even though it's no longer in effect. When it was in effect, I think one could hardly call it unholy. Certainly, it was a holy covenant. The
right.
Jews.
Oh yeah, the covenant God made with man when it was active was absolutely holy.
Yeah. So
do you see? Yeah, this is interesting, right? Because this is like a very nuanced issue, right? Because it's like you can kind of see how you could go with it either way. It's like it could be speaking about it in the past, because in the past when it was written, it was the covenant God was made with them. And if it's brought back in the future, they could be talking about it in those terms back then. And then it's brought back. But the question is, should we its holiness to the future event as being literal? What covenant is literally holy when that event occurs? Or should we look at it like it's called holy because it's written about when it was holy? So this is the issue where we have to have a little bit of not calling each other total heretics anyway, I guess.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of there's a lot to parse out. For the moment, I don't see it as being mutually exclusive. The beast could the horn of Daniel of the book of Daniel could be in opposition to the new covenant, which obviously we believe he will, as well as to the covenant which he makes with many. And the covenant that is made in Daniel 11, the Antichrist that's operating there, he obviously makes a covenant with the Jews. Now, the only question is whether or not, or for me, rather, at the moment, for me, the question is whether or not that covenant that's being made in Daniel 11 is the same as the covenant in Daniel 9. Now, I understand your interpretation says that it's not. It's
Are you pre-trib? Are you pre-trib?
Am I pre-trib?
Are you pre-tribulation rapture?
I am post-trib, pre-wrath. Basically, what
problematic. So then that means that in the New Testament, where this is I think important. This just struck me. I hadn't really thought about this, but this is why pre-tribbers are, I think, stick to their weird and obviously wrong interpretation or whatever, because there's issues with this, right? Because think about it. What is it that the Antichrist is doing during the tribulation for Christians? Isn't that towards Christians, or at least potentially towards Christians in the New Testament when Jesus talks about it, or Paul talks about it in 2 Thessalonians, which is tied to Jesus' things about his coming, but there's events in 2 Thessalonians regarding when Jesus comes as the resurrection, and then that's when the Antichrist is destroyed. And then also Jesus talks about what happens when he returns at his appearing. And so if that's talking to Christians, like you ought to probably read it, right? That means the Antichrist is the final Antichrist is operating, trying to give the mark of the beast. If you're post-trib, right? Or maybe you don't think that.
That's right.
But it seems to me that's a warning for Christians, the mark of the beast, which means the mark of the beast is doing something with Christians. Well, what covenant would that be that he's trying to obscure with Christians? Is there a future Antichrist that's not only obscuring stuff with Christians, but then the Christians are raptured, and now Daniel 8's really just talking about the old covenant with the Jews. That's not really an active covenant because God's brought the new covenant. See, that's a big kind of issue. And this is why standing for truth has to be like, well, there's a tribulation where the Antichrist has the mark of the beast for Christians, but then we're raptured. And then there's 7 years of tribulation against the Jews. And then God does this thing with the Jews, even though we don't really think there's any reason thing with the Jews, and the temple's been taken away. See, he has to have that, but the New Testament knows nothing about that. There is no 7 years. There's only one resurrection from the dead. There's only one return of Jesus in that sense, a second coming. He returns at the end of the 1,000 years, and the New Testament knows nothing about 7 years in between. That's basically just what might as well just be a pre-tribber, as far as I can tell. If you think there's got to be 7 years after the church is raptured for Israel, you know what I'm saying? It's like. And I heard Justin tell him that too, and they were arguing about it because Justin's like, they're arguing about it, and he's like force fitting stuff in there. That's the new.
Well, I think SOP's position, and like you said, this would have to be my position as well, which is that the last week of Daniel, the 70th week would be the last week in. The week in which the Antichrist assumes control, the first half of the 7 years being relatively peaceful, and that's when he is instituting, like you said, his mark. And during the first 3.5 years is when he is in communication with the Jews, and presumably by this point the new temple has already been built, and that's when he makes the way I see it, that's when the Antichrist makes the covenant, the treaty with them to allow them to practice their rituals, the animal sacrifice.
So you're mid-trib then? So are you saying that the Antichrist, the week starts before the Christians are raptured? So it's a tribulation, and it's for a week, and then once we're raptured, like mid-trib then, or mid-week, and then the mark of the beast is then implemented the first half of the week, or after the Christians are taken out, though?
I suspect the mark of the beast will be in effect. It'll be progressively. It'll be progressively imposed to greater extent as time goes by. Starting from. I suspect probably logically it would make most sense for it to begin even before the 70th week, and then by the time you get to
before
the start of the 70th,
right? The time of Jacob's trouble, maybe, or the time, or just the
right.
time.
It becomes prominent enough to where he has enough leverage to push it on everybody, and so for the Christians, most of the Christians that resist, he will be. Many Christians are killed who don't receive the mark. And then that lasts for 3.5 years. It'll seem like forever. It's going to be really bad. But the Jews, who may or may not receive the mark, many probably will see him as the Messiah. And the turning point will be when the Christians are raptured. That's when they realize that Jesus is the true Messiah. And that's when Jacob's trouble really begins. And that's when I believe in Daniel 11 is when the prince, the little horn, is enraged because something went sour, and then he breaks the treaty in the middle, and then starts to kill off the Jews. And that's when, and by this point, the Christians are raptured out. That's when you'll have the two witnesses, and that is when the conclusion of the regrafting of the house of Israel is fulfilled as laid out in Romans 11. There'll be the culmination of their regrafting will be completed within the 70th week, which is why I think in a sense it it's logical to give an outline of 70 weeks pertaining to the house of Israel, since since Israel isn't relevant in the church age, but then they come back onto the spotlight during the last week, during the 70th week, and so. But I understand you've pointed out that that there are some problems if you put such a big gap in there, and so there are a lot of details to really examine here. But that's how I see things so far, is that you have the Christians at the start of the 70th week. The mark of the beast is already going around, probably going around even right now, though we don't realize it. And then at the start of the 70th week, he's causing. He's got the false prophet and then the dragon behind him, propping him up, and then he's gonna. That's what he really tries to push it on the Christians and everyone else. Everyone else is gonna fall right in line. The Buddhists, the Muslims, they'll fall right in line, and they'll probably help the beast to behead many of the Christians, especially around the middle, the Near Eastern region of the globe. Many Christians will be killed off, and at some point, immediately after the abomination of desolation, which will be after he. So this is all happening within the first 3.5 years, I believe, is that you have Christians being killed off, being forced to take the mark of the beast. You have the beast making the treaty for 1 week, although in theory it would have to be that the temple would have already been built by that point, because you're not going to build it up so quick, I think. I mean, I don't know how fast they build things now over there, but there's already talk that they're already wanting to build a new temple over there. So I suspect it's going to get underway pretty quick, if not already. There are reports that they have all the things that they need for the table of showbread, and even the Ark of the Covenant. There are some rumor has it that they already have that taken care of. That they already have an ark ready to serve as for that purpose.
The one Ron Wyatt found under the old temple.
Yeah, that's one theory. And by the way, I happen to think that Ron Wyatt did find the actual Ark of the Covenant, because only his the design that he recounted, that he had an artist draw out, is the proper design for how it should be. Because
unlike the common one that people think is right, but it's not
right. Yeah. Because it's in the shape of a chair. That's a throne. That's the earthly throne of Jesus. All the rest of them, like in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's not a chair. You can't sit on that.
This is one thing some people in Adventism, like, they don't believe.
And also because in the text it says that the two wings of the cherubim are touching. Two wings, and the cherubim is already referring to both cherubim, one at each side of the ark, and it says their two wings are touching. If it were the case that they have both their wings extended out, you'd have 4 wings touching, but it only says 2 wings touching. 2 wings out of the 2 angels.
Yes,
it would be one wing, right. One wing from each angel, reaching out from the back, touching.
It makes it a seat.
So the design that Ron Wyatt drew out is, I believe, the correct one, which is why I have it in my avatar. Let me see if I have it right here. Nope.
I was going to ask you about that. I noticed that I was like, oh, he's got the ark there, and I was thinking that looks like the one I've seen drawn for that. And
yeah,
I was going to ask you about that, but everybody was talking so much. So what do you make of this? Here we have in Revelation 11. The temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple in heaven the ark of his testament. And there were lightnings and voices and thunderings.
So I see this as when the Jews finally have things set up, assuming they have the genuine vintage ark, which I have no reason to believe they don't. for the time being, assuming they have that and they set it up just prior to the beast enacting his abomination of desolation. I believe the ark will be taken out from underneath him. It'll be taken out, and it'll be a divine act. God will not allow the beast to defile his ark. It'll be taken out, received up into heaven, and it'll return probably at the end of the millennial reign, though in theory it could be at the beginning. But like the verse you pointed out, it's in heaven, so I suspect it'll return with the New Jerusalem, where Jesus's chamber is at the very top. You know, where the capstone would be. Oh, and by the way, I'm also assuming that the New Jerusalem is in the shape of a pyramid, as opposed to a cube. So he's at the very top.
Yeah.
And the Ark of and the Ark of the Covenant is there at the very top of the New Jerusalem. So when that's taken out, and when Christians are raptured out, and that's when the beast loses it, he goes into a rage fit, and then he goes off killing off Jews, and that's when the Jews realize they were dealing with a false prophet, a false Messiah. Jesus is the true Messiah, and then that's when Jacob's trouble will occur. That's when the 144,000 are sealed from each tribe of the house of Israel, thereby fulfilling the prophecy of Romans 11 that all Israel, meaning all 12 tribes of Israel, will be grafted back in. They will be saved, and they will endure all the way to the end.
What makes you qualify as it part of the tribes, you think?
The
issue I have with, like, when I stop to think about it, it's like everybody's probably related to the different tribes, you know, in the whole world. And then I would wonder, like, well, do you have to be part of the tribes because you claim it and reject Jesus and you live in Israel? Does that make you one of the tribes, or like do you have to have a certain percentage of like relationship? Or do you just
they go by if you're you know, if your mother is a Jew, then I wonder about the same thing. You know, exactly what makes a Jew a Jew. You know, what if you only have a small percent? You know, who knows?
What if you live in the land and you practice the religion of Judaism as it stands today, which actively electing the Messiah to be a Jew, and then like, is it because you practice in such a way that you fully reject your Messiah and then live but you also need to live in Israel? Or like, does it, like, if you're 14% blood of that tribe, then you're not part of it? But if you're 15% blood, and then but if you're only 14, do you qualify if you particularly reject Messiah strongly and practice Judaism as they understand it in the land? Would that make up for
this
it gets really convoluted. I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just like, how does that work?
Right. Yeah. It's
they're potentially getting like an extra chance here that other people don't get, right, in a certain way. I mean,
can it be taken to a spiritual sense to a certain degree, or does it strictly have to be a bloodline descent kind of thing? And if bloodline descent, then what percentage qualifies a person being of the house of Israel? Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't know. It's. I'm sure there's an answer. It's just
the best answer I've heard is just that, well, they do it by like genealogy, so it's just like,
right.
That seems problematic too, to know who's who.
Yeah, sure. The saints of the new covenant are even qualified as being the seed of Abraham. So that's
right. That's what, right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's traditionally taken in the spiritual sense, which is what I hold to. But logically, it could also be the case that the saints of the new covenant, regardless if you're Jew or not, maybe they all, by divine decree, have a small drop of Abraham's.
I think that's actually for sure the case.
So yeah, but you can see how it can become fatalistic in this sense. So I don't like to, you know.
To be honest, I think all that like is just being way too literal, what you're describing, and like I know people have that view of it, and like I know they want to be literalistic about it, but I think a better way to look at it is like, look, there's God's people of the new. I hope lots of Jews come in, but I think trying to make it about Jews, I just feel like the New Testament seems to not make the separation. It just seems like Jesus talks about his coming for his people, which means anybody who is, you know, in covenant with God through time. And then, you know, and the Antichrist is it just makes more sense to me that the culmination of the Antichrist change, making the mark of the beast and trying to, oppose God's covenant, that the fullness has to be focused on what Jesus did. And then anything that's happening at the very end should be looked at in the light of like, look, the one way to salvation that was always the pinnacle of God is the covenant Jesus made with the Jew first, and he established the church with them. And it's quoted in Hebrews that Jesus did this, or at least inaugurated it. So like all that temple stuff is just totally a convolution and confusion. And it's just more like, it's not about replacing the Jews. It's not about, it's about what was God's plan and what was always the focus. It's Jesus' ministry. And so what the Antichrist is doing is trying to corrupt God's people in Messiah. And that's the culmination of the spiritual battle between Christ and Satan manifest on the earth, which is really the pinnacle of, it's not some Jewish thing that's passed away and God's opened up and called all the nations back already 2,000 years ago. Now it's about between Christ and Satan. And we know the New Testament's ripe with this of us being the body of Christ if we believe in Messiah, Jew and Gentile, and that we are there's like many things Jesus and Paul talk about us being the temple collectively. And so like, it's just a question of how literal do you feel like you have to be about it. And like, I like the idea of being literal, but I think the New Testament literally is saying Jesus' covenant is what it's all about for the whole world. And the final battle is the culmination of the opposition to Christ between Christ and the spirit behind those who oppose God. Right. And so I don't know, I'm trying to be fair and open and like hear people out. And I get that Daniel is difficult, but
and like what we were touching on with trying to decipher Daniel 9, another compelling detail is the fact that in the book of Revelation, it highlights the beast as being going out to conquering and to conquer. But when you get to the point where the beast starts killing people, where things really get bad, it says that he continues on for 3.5 years. And that's exactly half of 7. Exactly half of 7 years. He goes on for 3.5 years. And in the book of Daniel, the little horn prince breaks his treaty in the middle of a 7-year period, so that whatever he's doing, and I think in Daniel 11, he even goes as far as to say that he will carry out many transgressions and he will prosper in his practice. So he's going to prosper he's going to prosper in his transgressions for 3.5 years. And in Revelation, the beast does what he does for 3.5 years. And so while it's true that it doesn't explicitly say that the beast in Revelation is doing his thing for 3.5 years as a latter half of 7 years total, the correlation is the half of a week. That's all I have. That's all. Daniel 9:27. Like if I had to debate this and I were to present my evidence, this would be one of the points. And it's not conclusive, but it's all I can see so far. And what you have on your side is that in Daniel 9, it says that 70 weeks are appointed to the house of Israel to make an end of sins, bring everlasting righteousness, and so on. It doesn't say to also complete the abomination of desolations, to do all of that later on in Daniel 11 it says that. So there is a little room for interpretation there. So that's what you have on your side, and so we're left to just work.
I don't think you heard this argument, but we know, like, if you recognize, as you should, in my opinion, I mean, anybody, you and whoever, and I don't, not necessarily you particularly, but like, we know how the Jews kept years. They're not 360-day years. It's just a fact, right? And so we know to correlate Jewish history with the years and other Babylonian calendars and to work all that out. And we know how their years operate, because that's how they correlate history, right? And we have other writings, and they were in Babylon, and we know what their calendar was like and how that worked. And we know that they counted a day for a year with the 490 years or the 483 years until the end of the 69th week to recognize Messiah. At least you ought to. But even if not, we know that the first 69 weeks, no matter how them, that we know how the Jews counted years, and they didn't count years with, you never get 360 days in a year. And so
Yeah.
to consider this argument, if you want to say the 70th week partially or wholly is future, okay, and you want to associate the 42 months as, that would work, just 42 months, saying it's typologically 3.5 days or 3.5 years, that could correlate. But when we know that the 1260 is also a way of rendering the 3.5 years of that same period, the problem is we know the 69 weeks were years, and that their years were not 360-day years or 30-day months for 12 months in a row. We know how they use the calendar. And so we know that the count of the first 69 weeks were never increments of a purely lunar calendar. So if some association of the 70th week and is according to the literal 1260 days, which is 3.5 years on a purely lunar calendar, why are the first 69 weeks not a purely lunar calendar, and that they have never used a purely lunar calendar from Daniel's time until even to this day? Why would that part of the last week or the whole entire week be an increment of a purely lunar calendar when we know, like you could say, well, it could change, or that's kind of symbolic, but we know that it says 70 weeks are determined. So they're called a block of 70. And then it may be split up, but we know how the first 69 were not purely lunar counts of years. And so what right do you have to say for some reason this 1260 can be associated with this block, the final week, and be a mere lunar count of the days when we know all the other ones were counted as seasonal years? You get the argument?
Yeah. I take all of that for granted. I'm not familiar with this calendar stuff whatsoever, and I have no reason to doubt what you're offering now. So, I've heard from not just yourself, from others, that this is one of the more compelling argument points that you can raise in favor of your interpretation, and so that. So yeah, I mean, I can't respond to that at all. It's and let me just touch on these last 2 points.
Yeah, I got to go to bed, so I'm going to give you the floor. And so thanks for joining me. I always love talking to you, and so just go on as long as you want. And thanks for everybody coming to watch. And we're going to figure this thing out. And pretty soon he's going to be agreeing with me. No, I don't know. I'm just kidding. I don't expect you.
Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate everybody in the audience listening. I'm not. I don't honestly. I don't really care that much one way or another. I'd like to know what the truth is on the matter, and so I'm trying to look at it and trying to understanding it the best way that I can. And so before this session ends, I just wanted to bring up the last 2 points from my notes, which is that so I raised the issue about the so you have I see it as being one of only 2 possible ways that he is making, because the interpretation that I see in favor of at the moment, and which is what Donnie is defending, is that it's the covenant that's being confirmed with many for 1 week is a treaty or an agreement that's made for a time span that covers 7 years, that 1 week, rather than an individual or a group of individuals confirming in a proactive sense, confirming, making that covenant with many for a time span of 7 years. And so that's where I see your position as being weaker in explaining, although you have provided an explanation. I'm just not convinced by it, which is that you're saying that it's Jesus who teaches the gospel for 3.5 years, and then he is cut off, and then his disciples continue on for another 3.5 years. The problem is that if you go strictly with what's in the text in the New Testament, which is what you have to refer to if there's anything to refer to in order to strengthen your position in light of interpreting Daniel 9, is that in the New Testament, as Jesus himself tells his disciples shortly before their last meeting shortly before he descends into heaven, ascends into heaven, is he tells his disciples to go out into the world to preach the gospel in all the nations. So you have Jesus who carries out his ministry for 3.5 years. He is crucified, and after he's resurrected, he tells his disciples to go out in all the world. And he even, in Matthew 24, he even tells his disciples that my gospel will go out into all the world, and then the end will come, which is a further reinforcement, I feel, of the emphasis of Jesus telling his disciples to go out into all the world, not laying any time limit. In other words, I see no 3.5-year designation for any of his disciples to fulfill that last 70 weeks before. In other words, if Jesus intended to convey to his disciples the fulfillment of Daniel 9:27 as being himself and his disciples fulfilling that prophecy for 7 years, I just don't see that anywhere in the New Testament. Now, on the other hand, if there were such a passage there, then I think your argument would be pretty much solid. There'd be no way to get around that. And so the other point is that the last thing is that the abomination of the desolation. So the desolation is mentioned in Daniel chapter 9 as being as occurring as something that occurs within the broad scope of a war that goes on, and then the people of the prince. Now, the people of the prince, I understand first, I think you take a dual application to that. In one way, it applies to the Jews, and in another way, it applies to the Roman army of Titus, I think. And now, if you apply it to Titus, that's when you run into another problem with Matthew 24, which is that Jesus explicitly says that watch ye therefore. And this is right after he tells them that first the gospel shall be preached in all the kingdoms of the world, then shall the end come. And right in the next verse, he says, watch ye therefore, when you shall see the abomination of desolation as prophesied by Daniel, then you'll know that the end has come. And so Jesus is acknowledging that the abomination of desolation is something to occur subsequent to contemporary to this end time, which is set in the future. Now, as per Matthew 24, you run into the problem of harmonizing the flooding of the city of Jerusalem and toppling of the temple with the abomination of desolation. If the abomination of desolation is, if you say that the house of Israel is left desolate because they did not receive Jesus as being the sign of the Messiah, and so he leaves their house desolate, then you have that, and that is not yet fulfilled in Matthew 24. But that's already mentioned after that the temple shall be taken down. In other words, these events are all connected. And so if you apply it to the Titus conflict that happens at 70 AD, in which the Roman army literally goes into Jerusalem and floods the city, topples down the temple, and if you take that to be the fulfillment, or rather a partial fulfillment, then you have to connect those two, and yet you have a 40-year gap between those two. So that's one issue that's one problem that I see that you'd have on your hand in having to explain. And on the other hand, if you say that it's the people of the prince, meaning Messiah, the prince of the Jews, then you'd have the problem of explaining how the Jews could have done anything that could be remotely qualified as being a war that's waged within their own nation, within their own city of Jerusalem, and toppling down their own temple, which they obviously didn't do. That happened in 70 AD. And so you're having to harmonize those two, and in one way or another. In other words, you'd have to qualify your interpretation of Daniel 9:27 on both these, applying it both to Titus and the Jews, and where it's most coherent to only apply to one or the other because of the 40-year gap. And the last thing is, let me see here. Overlapping of the inconsistent righteousness. Yeah, and I think I mentioned earlier, so the bringing in everlasting righteousness. So Jesus laid the foundation, and the church builds on that. And last and probably least is in all the English translations of the Bible, you have the prince, Messiah the prince, with a capital P, and then you have immediately after that with the lower P. Now, in order for your interpretation to be correct, it would have to be the case that was made in error. And for me personally, it may not be a problem for other people. It may not be a problem for, say, Donnie, but for me, that's somewhat of a problem, because here you have God, or at least the Holy Spirit, allowing for this error to be processed through into the English translation, when, for example, if you were to take the alternative interpretation of Genesis 1:1, where instead of "in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," being translated as "when God began to create the heaven and the earth," in other words, the latter being used to support the day age, the old earth creationist interpretation. And if you reject that and say, no, why would God allow that to be a fallacious translation in all the English versions of in all English translations of the Bible, when he intended for when the actual meaning is the alternative? Why would God allow that to be revealed in these latter days? And it's an equal problem on both hands. So if you say the lowercase p prince is a misinterpretation, that they were somehow misled or misunderstood, and God allowed that to happen, then basically I think you'd be picking and choosing.
Yeah, you do understand that you might as well just take it that it's my position that it is Titus and the Romans.
Okay, yeah, then okay.
Because I really don't need it to be the other way. I think I bring it up because I think it's a point regarding context.
Okay, so then
issues, but I'm fine with it being the Roman army and Titus. I basically think of it that way normally.
Okay, okay, and this is where you might be, because I don't know how Donnie would come at you with this, but the first time you had your dialogue with him, which I believe I watched the majority of it, which was that he used your concession to the he there being the lowercase prince being Titus. He used that to his advantage somehow to pin to tie in the book of Revelation, and saying that was a shadow fulfillment because he couldn't have fulfilled all of it. In other words, he I don't want to say he tricked you into that, because you accept it, and you accepted it, and I would agree that allowing it to be Titus offers a higher degree of coherency. And so if you say that that's Titus, that's the 70 AD, then the desolation there isn't Jesus leaving the house desolate. Then basically the he and that's what it boils down to, is who the he is. And so if it's not Jesus, then, you know, um, in other words, that's I think that's where the dividing line is. That's where the funnel splits splits the points for each debater. It's either Messiah the Prince or not Messiah the Prince. If you concede to the lower case prince being anyone other than Messiah, then you leave room for the revelation beast to be tied into that. And if you allow the revelation beast to be tied into that, then you have a pretty big vulnerability, I think.
It opens the door, because this is where one of those things where I would say it's like making it linear. Sorry, I said that so I wouldn't say anything, but I'm essentially I'm saying like, this is how.
But notwithstanding, and sorry, not to cut you off. Even with all this laid out, your argument with the 368 year thing, that still stands. So I haven't.
That's a big one. That's a big thing. It's a big issue, I think, and people just shrug it off. But like,
yeah. No, but I mean, what you've offered it is coherent in that it's the holy covenant that the horn beast prince is fighting against, because he knows that that's the true covenant, which is why it's qualified as the holy covenant. And the covenant that he makes is a fraudulent one, reflective of the old covenant, which Christ abolished. Now,
I think there's a way you can read it too, where there really is no covenant that the Antichrist makes. He's just talking about how he's trampling on the holy covenant, or the covenant that's in place between God and man, and he's obscuring that through false whatever. I don't even know that there's anywhere you have to say he makes a covenant. Maybe there's one place that suggests it. I know in Isaiah there's a covenant of death, making a death in Hades sort of thing in Isaiah 28 that seems to be related. But that could be just not like a literal covenant. It's just saying like, by rejecting the actual covenant for salvation.
But it's something also fascinating that I've thought about, because like what you touched on, and I'm really glad you did it, because it shows that we were thinking along the same lines, is that having the covenant being described as the holy covenant in Daniel 11, if that is referring to the new covenant, then it's really the prophet telling the congregation of Israel in a covert manner that the covenant which they are currently then under will be done away with when no one saw it coming. And
like it's I can afford that it's Jesus, because that's the only active covenant that brings salvation. And since it is future, if you're saying Daniel 11's future, the only holy covenant in the future is the new covenant. In my opinion, that's how I would say it. Yeah. So that's basically how I'm reading this, like that. Yellow is Messiah, and blue is what happens because of what happens with Messiah. That's as plain as I can say it. So it's a parallelism. It's not meant to be read so much linearly as it's meant to be like 26, Messiah, what's going to go on with the 70 weeks about Messiah and the city is mentioned in the blue. And then 27 just reiterates it with new details, and then tells you more about what will come of what happens.
Yeah, and see, I'm glad you, please keep this on your screen. I'm glad you put this highlighted, because it gives me something to work with. And that's why I appreciate sometimes when Charles busts out with the charts and all that. It's that with your position, the greatest vulnerability is in verse 27, where you highlighted in yellow, and he shall confirm the covenant. Now, if that's Christ, that he shall confirm the covenant with many, and in the midst of the weak, and the he there, he shall cause. It seems like you're still attributing that to the Messiah. He shall, because it's a continuous sentence, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and that's where you have the challenge of finding a way to disassociate the latter half of that blue part with the first half of that blue part, because the first half of that blue part transitions from that yellow part which is that the he shall cause, if that's still the Messiah, and he causes, which I agree, he did in a sense. He did away with the animal atonement thing, and so he caused that to cease. But then it goes on, and for the overspreading of abominations, and that's where you have the challenge of, because you can't, if you attribute that somehow to Christ, and I'll go as far as to say that you cannot concede to that you cannot contribute that to Christ.
No,
Abomination.
right. I don't get why people make it. I'm not sure why people make that such a strong. I think Jesus is the abomination. No, of course not. I think it's because of the sins of the Jews rejecting the Messiah, etc. The he shall make it desolate is Jesus makes the temple desolate
Right,
because
because
of
they rejected him.
their abominations.
Right,
And so it's saying, and that's what he tells them. He says, "To you, I leave you your house desolate." He
right.
tells them
Okay,
that right
I
before they
see.
kill him, right? And then he also tells about Matthew 24, the Romans will, when you see the city surrounded. So like it makes Jesus into this prophet that's already confirmed too, because he tells them to flee Judea when they see it, which tells you he's talking about the destruction of the temple, which he also strengthens his prediction from Daniel, according to Daniel the prophet. So you could also look at it like the abomination that surround, like, so the flood part, like it, so in 26, and then, I mean, you could correlate it in different ways depending on the translation. But in other words, Luke 23 and Matthew 24, he's literally predicting, to telling them what to do, because he knows he's going to die, his mission, according to Daniel. In the abomination of desolation, he's telling them what to look for to make sure they escape, because he knows it's going to happen according to Daniel. So he's like, because he's speaking about Daniel, right? And he knows he's going to die. He's the Messiah that's going to be cut off. So he's saying, look, I'm going to die and be ascended. So I need to tell you stuff you need to watch out for, because I'll be gone, right? And so he's saying, like, so here's the sign. When you see this surrounding the holy place, which is like the, what I find the most absurd is although there are classically, historically, a couple of different translation or ways of understanding this, but the whole eagle's wing thing, taking them out in Exodus, and that's him when it says, because the corpse is Jesus's body. Jesus is at that time is obviously alive. He's resurrected. So to say wherever the body is, the eagles are gathered, I think that's a totally weird. That's talking about the Roman army that had eagles on its flag surrounds the city, and
that
the
was
body is the Jerusalem, which has been left desolate. And so when you see that this temple's been made desolate because of my sacrifice, and I've ascended, and then you see these eagles surrounding it, that's your sign to leave. And they did, and all the Christians survived it.
Yeah, that was a pretty new concept for me as well, that Christ represented that corpse. Although I can see the typology there. Christ was slain, and he was the slain offering to which many flocked to. But I mean, it was the first time that I heard it. It just sounded kind of weird. I think
the metaphor also. But let me be clear to hear that. So there's a similar language about end of time, right? Where when around the rapture, where it says the same kind of thing, I think, where it talks about the maybe a slightly different way of saying it, but the idea is, in other words, is like, we have these in Revelation, we have the three angels' messages, and how these dirty birds, I think it's tied to like typology from the creation story. It's hard to explain, but I won't go into it. But in other words, at that time, it'll be, you can look at it like the saints and the marriage supper, where the body is, there the birds are gathered or whatever. It's said two different ways, and I think one of them correlates to the end of time, and one of them correlates to how the Christians escaped the partial preterism there. It's undeniable. To pretend like there's nothing there is, don't bitch at me for not accepting Antiochus if you're going to say that partial preterism is totally wrong. But I don't know if anybody's caught on to that yet, that criticism of my view. But so sorry, I said I wouldn't talk anymore. So
no, it's okay. And I know you wanted to, because I know it's getting late, but I'm glad we got to this point, because it's really, we're getting to where the key issue is, and I just wanted you to focus more on this, because this is going to be where the heart of the debate is. This is going to be the climax of the debate, in my opinion, which is that so let me just lay out and see if I understand you correctly. You're saying that the overspreading of abominations is in reference to the continuation of the animal sacrifices after Christ had already been resurrected and paid for all their sins. And because they continued in their animal sacrifices, Christ made their house desolate. Is that right?
I would say, well, that could be it. But I would say more likely, because he said it before he died, that he's going to leave the house desolate. It's more about because of their disobedience historically, and then it capped off by rejecting the actual Messiah, because he says, "You did not recognize the time of your visitation. I leave your house to you desolate."
Yeah.
Speak the leadership.
No, I can. Yeah, that kind of that does make sense to me, because following right there where it says he shall make it desolate. So if you go with that interpretation, it kind of makes sense why it would say even until the consummation.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And 26b is and the end thereof. So like on the wing of all this stuff, right? So it's like it kind of has the feel of him saying like, look, this isn't necessarily within the 70 weeks, but this is what happens because of what goes on in the 70 weeks.
Right,
which is 26a.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine this being only 3.5 years.
Yeah, so it's just like, let me tell you about the 70 weeks, and then I'll say, and by the way, this and this and this and this and this will be the outcome of that, which isn't necessarily in the 70 weeks, but because of this.
Because notice,
because
notice in verse 27 that it says he shall make it desolate. Okay, so that's he'll make it desolate. So in a general sense, you have one event there, and that desolation lasts for a period of time, which is in question. Now, in verse 26, it says, and unto the end of the war, desolations, plural, are determined. So what does that mean exactly? And that's where I see you have a window of opportunity to justify your position by highlighting the desolation that first occurred when the Jews rejected Jesus as Messiah, and then continuing on with their animal sacrifice, he made their house desolate, even up to the point of 70 AD when it got toppled down.
Yes,
and then even until the consummation 2,000 years later.
Yes, I can see that, and so like that's something I've been kind of just thinking about.
And
like, it does seem to sound like it reaches down till the end.
Right.
Like, there will not be a temple.
And the fact that it says even until implies that this desolation period will end at some time, meaning that you'll have another temple built.
Yeah,
and then
it could be, or it could just be right up that it'll just remain so until until possibly not until the very end.
Right, but since we know that right, but since 70 AD happened, we know that it was toppled down, and so we can say that it's desolate. It's gone. I mean, not all of it. You still got the Western Wall thing, going on there, but it's it's not functioning. It's not a functional temple. It's desolate,
right?
For all intents and purposes.
That's the main thing. People always want to say, well, they kept put the sacrifice to an end, and I'm saying no. Think about this: the sacrifices that they did were meaningless in the sense of like the act, right? God didn't like the act of it if they didn't actually repent and understand what they meant. So when he died, they went from being the way they were, someone is obedient to God, to having faith in God and trust in God that he is going to be taking away your sins, which you're repenting of. You're doing what he said when you do the sacrificial system, because that's the way he's communicated to you, to have him take your sins away. So that's the meaning of the sacrifices. So it doesn't matter if they kept killing animals. I'm sure someone's been continued killing animals in all sorts of different ways since then. Is what matters is, were they trusting what God had sent them for the provision for their sins? So this is where people's literalism just rots their brain, because it's like, that is not in my mind anyways, this is not an argument against he putting a sacrifice. He made the way of getting you right with God for your sins desolate, which was sacrifices. But when he was sacrificed, and have you seen the document I have about the Talmud and how the Jews literally admit that the very year Jesus died?
Yeah, I remember you. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. To me, that's just, there you have it.
No, I mean, yeah, it makes sense. It could very well
That's the
be.
greatest non-Christian
Um,
source that proves Jesus is the
Desolations
Messiah.
are determined. So then, so in this way, your interpretation is able to accommodate both history as well as the Book of Revelation. The Titus event, 70 A.D., was the culmination of the first desolation, because they rejected Jesus, continuing on with the animal sacrifice, and then the house, the temple was left desolate until our day, and maybe in the near future, at some point, a third
Mhm.
temple is going to be built, and that's when it'll be the official fulfillment. So the Titus is a shadow fulfillment, and the official one occurs when the beast of the and this will be Daniel 11, I think. Uh, so yeah, so Daniel 11 slash of slash Revelation. You have the beast, which will do his thing, which may or may not be 7 years in total, but we certainly know that the latter half of it, the really bad part of it, is 3.5 weeks, 3.5 years, which conforms again to so I can see how you have the window of opportunity in making a dual application of the covenant. So you have a covenant that Christ established, and that the Antichrist, the beast of Revelation, will also establish, because he's a counterfeit Christ. But the Titus is the people of the prince that shall come. That is in reference to 70 AD. What will culminate in the 70 AD in the destruction of the temple? That's the first desolation because of what the Jews did.
Yes. Yep. And there's kind
So
of an
yeah,
overlap with the second
I see
coming
it could make
right at
sense
the end of
now.
the consummation.
Yeah,
This
now
is
I
the
could
thing
be.
you got to look at this though too, man. I'll give you the link. But when you realize that Isaiah 53, the one everybody uses to prove Jesus, is tightly correlated to the 6 things here in Daniel 9:24, and you realize the language used in the Hebrew here in Isaiah 53, and if you go over this carefully and you
Right.
consider the things there at the top, I
Now,
mean,
just in the way that you've been able to answer my concerns, the things that I wrote down, and I just listed the top ones, and so seeing that you were able to answer them in a way that was believable and made sense, was logical, um, that should leave you with enough confidence to to take the challenge of the formal debate that was supposed to happen with you and SFT, and you can now present your case. Now, I think you have a considerable case to make. I don't know. I'm sure Donnie has gone over it with you, but I don't know exhaustively all of his argument points, because he even brings in the signs. You have the different signs in Book of Revelation, and going by your interpretation, certain signs would have to occur either before or after. I'm not familiar with that. But again, you have the year thing, the 360-day year. So
well,
it'll be an interesting.
I also have the entire swarm of Protestant reformers that were agreeing that the historic view is the right interpretation. And that's the thing with Daniel. When Donnie came in, first of all, he just came in randomly, and I was like, we're going to talk about Daniel with somebody else, and then he went right into Revelation, which I haven't even been looking at, and so I was just like, dude. I don't know when the seals are going to be. You can cram it all in the future. My claim is that this stuff happened in history, which so you're just going to be like totally like, he's going to have incredulity about it. He's just going to be like, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. It's like, well, really? Are you sure? That's why the debate is like, in a lot of ways, will be
Yeah,
fruitless.
you have a lot to you do have a lot to use as ammunition. That's a fact.
Yeah, that's why I just wanted to focus on
So
Daniel. But I mean, I can make a case that my view correlates really well historically with things that are actually can be shown to be happen. But if you're not aware of that and how the Catholic Church, literally ruled civilly and religiously as one for exactly 1260 years, according to the pattern in Daniel, like the 3 horns that rise up in Daniel 7, and then he takes those out, and how the Pope armies took out the Ostrogoths literally in like 538, and they assumed religious and civil power And then that lasted for 1,260 years exactly till 1798, when Napoleon went into the Vatican and took the Pope off the throne and threw him in a prison, and they lost their power civilly. And then the Pope died there, and they've never really gained back that civil power. And then that's right when the French Revolution happened and the Enlightenment period started.
Right.
So all that, I mean, that's just one of the main that was 1,260 years. And guess what? Daniel's a day for a year, then 490 years. So the 1,260 days are the same, because 1,260 days are never, which are 3.5 quote unquote years, are never 1,260 days ever on a Jewish calendar. But they counted years so they would know when Messiah came, and the New Testament reflects that. And we know that those are how they counted years, because we correlate it historically with our calendar.
Yeah, and make sure you have all this, have all these points on what exactly what you just relayed to me. Make sure you have all these points, in a slide that you can show, because this is going to be one of your leading points. And like I said, I'm still learning about it. And once you present the historical aspect of your argument pertaining to the Jewish calendar year, then it'll make it more convincing. And so
Merritt, watch this. I put the thing in the private chat. You should look over this, because it's a really good summation of the similar arguments I make. Not necessarily all of them. I think he's a little more preterist than I would want to be, but I wanted to say one thing about the historicism thing, and I went off on a thing. And I want to make sure I tell you this. All the Protestant reformers were saying the Pope was the Antichrist because they had the historical view that I'm talking about, which points that one succession of a kingdom after the other from Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, and the little horn is the final power, because he correlates with Daniel 8 and Daniel 7, the final power, have overlaps that are undeniable, which have overlaps with the guy in Daniel 11. Okay, 7, 8, and 11 are correlated as something in common with all of these, and we see that that's a
that makes sense, because everybody, just about everybody that has even the slightest familiarity with the Catholic Church knows how the office of the papacy is elevated to near divine status. He's like a god on earth. And so
but think about this. Did you realize the history of this, though? All the reformers were saying, from this perspective, that because it's a succession of kingdoms, that these are not literal 1,260 days, but years, and that correlates historically with how the Catholic Church ruled, and that the Protestant Reformation is happening towards the end of this period, right? And they're all saying this Antichrist is the seat. Do you know that your guys' view, almost into, overall, for the most part, there were people who had little pieces of it, maybe differently than, but all the reformers were saying this. And so what does Rome do? It makes a counter order within its ranks called the Jesuits. Okay. This is just historically true. This isn't conspiracy theory. They invent the counter Reformation order called the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola. And then they have two different scholars, the main one being Ribera, who is a Jesuit. Counter-Reformation literally invents futurism, which says, oh no, this can't be the Pope because it's a single person and it's all in the future. And then one of their other scholars invents, that's a Jesuit during the Reformation period or shortly thereafter, says, no, preterism's true. All this stuff is fulfilled in the first century. It's all fulfilled. It's done with. That was just the Roman, Nero or whatever. And so they invent two views that make it so it's all in the future, hasn't happened yet, or all in the past, it's already passed. So it can't be the Pope. Reformers, all the fathers of our traditions as evangelicals and whatever you want to call yourself, we're children of the Reformation. We're not Catholic. And all our forefathers were pointing this. And now 95% of Christians have bought this view that was essentially invented by the people who were counter-Reformationists, who happened to invent these two views, which take the pressure off of the Pope. Just saying that is the historical case.
No, it would make sense. If it is going to be a Pope, it would have to be, I would say, a Pope of Jewish descent, or at least having some, Jewish blood in him, because then it would be able to correlate with it'll conform to the Daniel 11 about the prince not observing the God of his fathers.
And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean that the view is wrong. I want to say that it doesn't mean that my view is right. It doesn't mean that I'm a Molinist to some degree, and that's a Jesuit Molina who invented it. I don't want to be an idiot about it. I'm just saying it's interesting that that's the case, but it doesn't prove anything. It's just kind of something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you got that word. Can you put the Daniel 9:27 back up real quick? It was a
sure.
And this will be the last thing.
Yeah, I won't interrupt again. But I had that was good
because I know it's getting late for you, and it's my battery is down too. Yes, it's starting to run out now. So you got that worked out about. So it's Titus, the prince, the people of the prince that shall come. That's in reference to 70 AD. That fits pretty nicely. And then in now, I'm sure you'll be challenged. Well, why would the narrator shift from referring to the enemy of the Messiah, which you concede to in verse 26, and all of a sudden refer to back to the Messiah, the Prince? Well, you just say that that the language permits it. It doesn't have to be a linear chronological succession. You can go back and forth, left, right, right, left. And I mean, that's take it or leave it. And if it fits, then you can go into the evidence about what you just gave about the people that were doing the sacrifice and the color having changed, the fabric and all that. I think that's a pretty compelling anecdotal piece of evidence, which you could present there. So, okay, so in verse 27, that's starting out. So that's back to Messiah the Prince. He confirms his covenant. Now, the only thing there that you have to, I think you're going to have to work more on is with many for 1 week. The only thing that you have to tie that 1 week with is the 70th week laid out earlier up a few verses up. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, and so on and so forth. And then you'll say, well, that's what the 1 week is. And then your opponent could say, or anyone opposing your view could say, well, why would it be 1 week? Christ only preached for 3.5 years. He was crucified. And then Christ even himself told his disciples to go out in all the world, not for 3.5 years, but just go out until until for the rest of their lives to do that. And so that'll be for many decades. And then so they'll present you with that challenge. And then so you'll have to come up with a coherent response to that in a way, preferably in a way that's not eisegetical. But if you have to, then, I mean, at least you still have the other points to rely on. Okay, and then in the midst, so that's him, because he is cut off, he caused the sacrifice to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, and then now you'll say that that's not the Messiah doing it. That's the people, that's his own people having rejected him, and then subsequently continuing to offer their sacrifice, which is what Paul was contending with in a lot of his, the letters to the Galatians, to the Hebrews, trying to get them to get off of the old covenant, the animal sacrifice. But they, many of them continued with that. And because of that, as Christ prophesied, which will be what you're proposing, he left their house desolate. And that culminated in 70 AD, which conforms to the latter end of verse 26, even until, which implies a long period of time. Otherwise, I mean, that's an emotional appeal, but it's still worthwhile in my opinion, because it would work on me, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And so here you have one desolation event in Daniel 9:27, which culminates in 70 AD. But in verse 26, there are multiple, it's desolations, plural, which is, I would say, which you could say is more inclusive of the broad scope of things, which would include uh, the um, the events of the Book of Revelation and uh, Daniel 11, and then so that is a shadow fulfillment, which you would agree
That is
with
exactly right.
with
Yeah, that's
Donnie.
it.
And then when the beast comes in and establishes his system, it'll be the official fulfillment, uh, and uh, and um, and you would further argue that in the book of Revelation, it is true that it says that the beast will carry out his deeds in in the worst part of his reign within a 3.5 year period. And then so your opponent would say, see, that's exactly half of 70 years. And that conforms to verse 27, where it says that in the midst of the week, 3.5 years into it, he'll start his transgression, which will last for another 3.5 years, which will be Jacob's trouble. But then you can counter that in saying, well, there's nothing in the book of Revelation that says that that 3.5 year period is part of 7 years. It could be 7 years, or it could be 9 years, or it could be 5 years or 4. It doesn't say. And furthermore, you can reinforce that with the verse up above, where it says 70 weeks are determined upon thy people to finish the transgression, bringing everlasting righteousness and the Messiah. But it doesn't say to for the desolation, the abomination of desolation. It doesn't say. It doesn't mention anything about the war, and so the text there seems to
Does it say
exclude.
about the Antichrist?
Right. Exactly.
Say
Yeah.
he's going to in your temple. It's about what Jesus did.
Right.
Period.
So the biggest challenge that I see, in my opinion, that I can see so far, for me at least, because everything that you raised about the 300, the calendar thing, I take that for granted because I'm not familiar with that. I don't know how your opponent would counter that, but at least as far as I can see, the biggest challenge that you have is giving a sound explanation for why Christ's ministry is qualified as having occurred within a week or 7 year time span, when Jesus only preached for 3.5 years, and then he explicitly tells his disciples to preach his gospel for the rest of their lives. So that's the challenge that I see that you have on your hand, to explain that, and then to also as an extension of that, to also give an explanation for the Matthew 24, the abomination of desolation, in connection with 70 AD. The abomination of desolation then would be something other than what Christ does, because the abomination of desolation that Jesus mentions in Matthew 24, you'll have to give a claim as to why that should be taken separate from Daniel 9:27. Because in Daniel 9,
it's not separate. It's not separate. It's the second half. It's related to the second half of Daniel 9:27. What happens to their city, Messiah being rejected, and their sins being great, and not accepting Messiah for their sins. And so but I actually think there's an abomination also regarding
okay, but
time.
yeah,
I just
the problem with that is Christ mentions that in conjunction in conjunction with the temple being toppled down. So they're kind of tied together there.
Right. So when I think
okay. So you're going to say that that's Christ.
AD, yeah, Christ tells them the abomination of desolation is what he's describing about when they see the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem after he's ascended. He's predicting that their near future, when the Jerusalem gets destroyed or surrounded by Rome, when Titus comes in, according to Luke 23, the parallel passage of Luke 21, where it describes that. But I'm not denying that there's a future application. I just do not think it's in the same way, right?
That's where that's where okay, so okay, all right, then you can connect that. So then the main point then I just want to leave you with tonight then is just to give a sound explanation for the week-long ministry, why should it be that Christ only preached for 3.5 years? He tells his disciples to preach for the rest of their lives, but yet in 9:27 it says for 1 week. If you can give a sound explanation for that, I think you got all your bases covered. My battery power is at 2%, so it might cut off at any
thanks
moment.
for coming, man.
I just want to say, thanks for having me on. I look forward to watching the debate. So I just want to encourage you to be confident in your position, in the same way that you've explained, addressed my concerns tonight. You can do the same in a formal debate. So yeah, thanks for having me on. And if it should be that the next time we talk about it is still before your formal debate, then I look forward to parsing these details out a little further. I'm seeing your position being made more coherent and more resilient to criticism. But of course, I don't know what Donnie may bring, and I'm being swayed from side to side. I'm in one way, I can see arguments fitting the traditional interpretation. Another way, I can see arguments that can't be refuted from your position. And so I'm somewhere in the middle. But I don't care about it either way. I would.
Yeah, I hear you.
I look forward to seeing how the facts are laid out and how the reasoning is applied. So on that note, I want to say thanks again for having me on, and thanks to everyone in the audience for listening. My battery power is at 1%. It's going to cut off at any moment, so I'll just hit the X button now. So thanks again, and God bless.
I hope you can come back as like a coherent, like a layout, just like the best way to attack it with the different arguments. I'm still working on a way of an overall picture to kind of describe a quick overview of how best to approach. Because my goal is, because I know people like to just play team sports, and I know Donnie's not really interested in really actually looking at my perspective or really taking seriously a lot of the issues, at least as far as I can tell. I could be wrong about that. And I haven't even really tried to attempt to show him, although I have told him for a long time, you got to at least see this view before you make any decisions. But he went and wrote his book, and it doesn't seem like he knows anything about historicism. Or I know, like, Stephen Anderson wouldn't give a damn about the Protestant reformers, even though he's absolutely a child of that in a very large sense. And if we do not understand our history, we are doomed to repeat it. But I already know that's going to happen, because I have extra help from my tradition. So, and you can already see it if you understand what was said about what would happen before Christ returns. And it's so obvious that we're in the end times. And I see it, by the way, what I was taught growing up and what I see Christians saying and doing. And so rather than being like excited about that, I'm actually kind of sad about it. It's like overwhelming to see the way Christians see the Bible, and I just hope that they'll try to see more of their history of what God was doing historically and calling his people. So God bless you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Happy Sabbath.